The most frightening version of this tape is not the version where we can prove it happened. No reliable source in the research record confirms that a real public access station deliberately broadcast a funeral for people who are still alive. That sentence matters. It keeps the door locked against rumor. It stops the story from pretending to be a solved case. But it does not make the image harmless, because every piece around that impossible broadcast has a real counterpart. The channel could be real. The low-budget civic access system could be real. The ritual could be real. The paperwork error could be real. The hijacked signal could be real. The false warning tone could be real. The archive could remember something that no one in the room understood at the time. So the question is not, did a public access station air a funeral for the living? The better question is colder than that. If one appeared on a local cable channel late at night between a city council replay and a school board meeting, would anyone know what they were watching? Would it be art? A clerical error? A religious ceremony? A wellness exercise? A hoax? A memorial mislabeled by a scheduling volunteer? A pirate signal? A warning? Or something worse, a normal local broadcast assembled from real civic machinery that became horrifying only because the names on the screen belonged to people who were not dead. That is the contradiction at the center of this archive report. The specific legend is unverified. The supporting fears are not. Public access television in the United States belongs to a family of channels commonly called PEG channels, public, educational, and governmental access. These are not network channels in the familiar sense. They are local, civic, often modest, and historically tied to the idea that communities should have a place on cable systems for their own meetings, announcements, ceremonies, lectures, and small productions. The details matter because public access was built around a kind of openness. Local franchising authorities may require cable operators to set aside channels for PEG use. They may require services, facilities, or equipment to support that use. The Cable Communications Policy Act of 1984 amended the Communications Act in a way that allowed franchising authorities to require channel capacity, facilities, or financial support for PEG purposes. That is not sinister by itself. It is a media policy tool. A Congressional Research Service report described PEG channels as a tool for localism. Cable systems use public rights-of-way, including streets and sidewalks, and local access obligations grew from the idea that if a cable operator used public space to reach homes, the public could be owed some space in return. But horror often begins in systems designed for trust. A public access channel can feel almost too human. Its camera work may be uneven. Its audio may be thin. A title card may sit on screen for too long. A parade may run beside a zoning hearing. A retirement ceremony may sit beside a church-adjacent lecture, a school concert, a candidate forum, or a tape from a room no viewer recognizes. The channel does not need to look polished to enter the home. Sometimes its authority comes from being boring. And in that boredom, the viewer lowers every defense. The rules around content deepen the unease. PEG-use rules may allocate time among competing applicants on a content-neutral basis. They may require minimum production standards or user training. But cable operators generally may not control the content of public access programming, except that they may refuse programming reasonably believed to contain obscenity. Again, this is not evidence of a crime or a cover-up. It is evidence of a door, a legal and civic door. One designed so ordinary people, schools, governments, and institutions could speak locally without having to pass through the same filters as commercial broadcasting. But if you are imagining a tape titled like a funeral, labeled with names, aired to a neighborhood, this is where the imagination finds the hinge. A channel built to let the community in may also let uncertainty in. The funeral itself is not purely fictional either. Living funerals exist as documented ritual forms. Reuters reported in 2019 that more than 25,000 people had participated in mass living funeral services at Seoul's Hyeowon Healing Center since it opened in 2012. The report described participants wearing shrouds, writing wills, facing funeral portraits, and lying inside closed coffins for around 10 minutes. That image is not supernatural. It is not a ghost story. It is a confrontation with mortality, staged while the participant is still breathing. But remove it from its documented setting, Remove the explanation. Put it on a local channel with a static title card and a municipal time slot. Show a portrait. Show a coffin. Show a person's name. Let the viewer recognize that person from the grocery store or the library or the school pickup line. The ritual becomes an accusation. Japan gives the archive another documented echo. A 2024 article reported that 500 people gathered at the Tokyu Hotel in Tokyo on February 19, 1993, for the living funeral of entertainer Mizunoe Takiko the day before her 78th birthday. The ceremony reportedly included a portrait, a flower-adorned altar, Chopin, Gregorian chants, Russian religious hymns, and prayers from multiple traditions. The point is not that these ceremonies were fake deaths. The point is that the culture of the living funeral makes one disturbing phrase factually possible. A funeral can be held for someone who is alive. Then there is the second fear, that a system can declare the living dead. The Associated Press reported in 2024 on a Kentucky man who was mistakenly declared dead in 2021. Surgery was avoided, and the man was still alive when the case was publicized. That fact does not prove any public access broadcast. It does something narrower and more unsettling. It shows that modern institutions can misidentify the boundary between life and death in ways that affect real procedures, real paperwork, and real bodies. Cornell's Weck summary of the Uniform Determination of Death Act describes death as the irreversible cessation of circulatory and respiratory functions, or the irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain, including the brainstem. The definition is clinical, careful, and legal. It exists because the boundary matters. Horror enters when the wrong record crosses that boundary first. A local broadcast does not need to kill anyone to harm them. It only needs to announce that the world has already filed them away. The third fear comes from the signal itself. Television has been interrupted before in ways that became part of broadcast folklore because they were real, witnessed, and never fully resolved. WTTW reported that on November 22, 1987, its broadcast of the Doctor Who serial Horror of Fang Rock was interrupted by a pirate signal showing a person in a Max Headroom mask. WTTW also reported that WGN's 9 p.m. newscast was hijacked that evening and that WGN restored its broadcast after about 30 seconds. The WTTW interruption lasted about 90 seconds, according to WTTW. The Federal Communications Commission investigated, but WTTW reported that the perpetrator was not identified. The Max Headroom incident matters here because it proves a viewer's private assumption can be wrong. The screen in the living room is not always carrying what the station intends. Sometimes a signal arrives wearing a mask. And then there are false alerts, the part of the archive that touches panic directly. The FCC warned in 2013 that transmitting emergency alert system attention signals or codes, or simulations of them, outside a genuine alert or authorized test violates federal law and undermines public safety. An FCC order discussing misuse of the emergency alert system cited a 2013 zombie attack hoax in which false alerts warned that dead bodies were rising from graves. That detail sounds absurd until you sit with what it means. A false message about the dead rising was not only a campfire story or a movie premise. It entered the regulatory record as an example of emergency alert misuse. So we have the ingredients, each documented separately. A local channel infrastructure designed for access. A legal framework that limits cable operator control over public access content. Real rituals in which living people participate in funeral-like ceremonies. Real cases where living people have been mistakenly treated as dead by institutional systems. A famous unsolved broadcast intrusion in which a masked figure broke into television programming. False emergency messages serious enough for federal enforcement attention. None of that proves the funeral tape exists. It explains why the imagined tape feels as if it could. An archive-report horror investigation has to stay honest about that line. We are not handling a confirmed incident where a station intentionally aired funerals for the living. We are handling a nightmare assembled from civic access, ritual practice, bureaucratic error, signal vulnerability, and public trust. The terror is not a single documented broadcast. The terror is the compatibility of the parts. A public access station does not have to be evil to become frightening. It only has to be local. It only has to be open. It only has to carry a program whose meaning depends on context that the viewer does not have. A coffin on a wellness center floor is one thing. A coffin on channel playback at midnight is another. A portrait at a living funeral, surrounded by explanation, can be a meditation on mortality. The same portrait, broadcast without warning beside a familiar name, can become a death notice. And a death notice, once public, behaves differently from a private mistake. It enters memory. It enters conversation. It may enter recordings, schedules, archives, and web pages. The living person has to argue against the image that already reached the town. That is why the first chapter cannot begin with proof. It begins with the absence of proof, and with the machinery that makes the absence uncomfortable. To understand how such a thing could appear plausible at all, we have to look at what public access was built to let in. Not monsters, not ghosts, but neighbors, institutions, local governments, school events, equipment rooms, application forms, cable franchises, and the strange democratic promise that a community should be able to see itself on screen. The promise at the end of the last chapter was not that a town channel is dangerous by nature. It was almost the opposite. The unease comes from how ordinary the system is supposed to be. Public access was built around a civic idea that sounds harmless, even generous, that television should not only descend from national networks, distant studios, and professional newsrooms. It should also rise from the place where the cable lines are buried, where the streets are repaired, where the school board meets, where a parade turns slowly past the same storefronts every year. It should have room for the people who live inside the signal. That idea is often gathered under three letters, PEG, Public, Educational, and Governmental Access Channels. The name is plain because the purpose was plain. Public access for community speakers and producers. Educational access for schools and learning institutions. Governmental access for local meetings, notices, and civic business. In practice, these channels could become the lowest, quietest layer of local television. City councils, planning commissions, school events, local ceremonies, community announcements, candidate forums, instructional programs, church-adjacent calendars, parades, and tapes made by people who are not trying to become famous. This is important for the nightmare, because the channel is not imagined first as a haunted place. It is imagined as a permitted place. A cable system does not float above a town. It enters it physically. It uses public rights-of-way, streets, sidewalks, and other corridors held for public use. The wires and infrastructure that bring channels into private homes depend on access through shared civic space. That physical fact helped shape the policy argument behind local access obligations. If a cable operator benefits from the public pathways of a town, then the town, through its local franchising authority, may require something in return for public use. The local franchising authority is the public body that grants the cable franchise. It is the local gatekeeper of the arrangement, though not in the dramatic sense of standing over every program before it airs. Its role is structural. It can negotiate and impose obligations connected to the franchise. It can require that channel capacity be set aside for public, educational, or governmental use. It can require support in the form of services, facilities, or equipment for PEG use. The cable operator, in turn, runs the system that carries those channels into subscribers' homes. That division of roles is one of the quiet facts that makes public access feel so different from ordinary broadcasting. The channel may be carried by a cable company, but the content is not simply the company's own voice. It is not a polished schedule built entirely around commercial programming. It is a window reserved for local use because the franchise arrangement allowed, or required, that window to exist. The Congressional Research Service described PEG channels as part of a United States media policy tool for localism. Localism is one of those words that can sound bloodless until you picture it working. It means the screen is supposed to have some responsibility to the community immediately around it, not just to a market, not just to an audience segment, to a place. Localism is why a town meeting can appear where a movie might otherwise be. It is why a school concert can become cable programming. It is why the camera in the back of a municipal room matters. It is why a resident with training, equipment access, and a scheduled slot might be able to make something that is not filtered through the instincts of a national broadcaster. The system was designed, at least in part, to lower the wall between the viewer and the medium. In a healthier light, that is democratic. In a darker light, It is intimate. A public access channel does not have to look like television as viewers usually understand it. It can look like fluorescent rooms. It can look like a lectern, a folding table, a microphone with a loose cable, a bulletin board, a fixed camera aimed at an empty dais before a meeting begins. It can look like a tape started too early or left running too long. It can look like a room waiting for someone to speak. That visual language matters because analog horror often borrows credibility from boring images. The fear is not only in what appears, it is in the frame that seems too mundane to lie. A town channel carries the authority of routine. Viewers learn not to expect spectacle there. They expect announcements, calendars, minutes, hearings, local faces, and the soft drone of institutions. If something impossible or intimate appears in that space, the first response may not be panic. It may be recognition. The viewer may ask, "Is this for us?" That is the special power of PEG channels in this story. They are not distant. They are addressed to the town. The research record places these channels inside a broad national system rather than a single strange exception. A Congressional Research Service report stated that subscribers to more than 1,500 United States cable systems had access to PEG channels. American Community Television estimated more than 1,500 PEG access centers, managing upward of 5,000 PEG channels. The numbers matter because they show that local access was not a rare oddity. It was an ordinary civic infrastructure spread across many communities, each with its own habits, rooms, volunteers, staff, procedures, tapes, and schedules. A horror story does not need every one of those channels to fail. It only needs the viewer to understand that such a channel could exist in their town, or the next town over, or in the town where their parents still live. The channel is familiar enough to be ignored and official enough to be believed. The PEG framework also included rules that could organize access without turning the channel into a centrally controlled editorial machine. Time among competing applicants could be allocated on a content-neutral basis. Minimum production standards could be required. Training requirements could exist. These details are not decorative. They tell us that public access was not necessarily a free-for-all. There could be forms, orientations, studio procedures, equipment checkouts, standards for whether a tape could be aired, and schedules built around neutral rules rather than the preferences of the cable operator. But those safeguards also create a particular kind of unease. They make the channel feel procedural. If a program appears, it feels as if it passed through some ordinary civic process, even if the viewer does not know what that process was. Someone requested time. Someone submitted material. Someone booked a slot. Someone labeled a recording. Someone placed it in rotation. Or, at least, that is what the screen implies. And implication is dangerous in an archive. A funeral broadcast for living people, as a confirmed real incident, is not established in the sources. But the policy structure explains why the image clings so well to the mind. Public access was made to admit local material that would never belong on a national network. It could admit amateur production. It could admit ceremonies. It could admit memorials. It could admit municipal and institutional footage. It could admit a program whose power did not come from professional quality, but from the fact that the names and faces belong to the same community as the viewer. The path from sidewalk to screen is not mystical. It is administrative. A cable operator uses public rights of way. A local franchising authority grants the franchise. PEG obligations can reserve channel space and support community access. Facilities and equipment can make production possible. Scheduling systems can place local programs into rotation. Subscribers at home encounter the result as part of the channel lineup, sitting alongside all the other signals that arrive through the wall. That is what public access was built to let in, the local world, with all its plainness and all its vulnerability. The fear begins when the civic doorway is treated as if it were a supernatural opening. But the doorway did not have to be supernatural. It only had to be real. It only had to be open enough that a town could see itself. And when a town sees itself on a screen, it does not only see celebrations. It sees records. It sees names. It sees meetings where decisions become official. It sees ceremonies where private grief becomes public memory. It sees the small machinery by which a community tells itself what has happened. That machinery was not an accident. It was reinforced by law, by franchise agreements, by the idea that local use deserved channel capacity and support. The horror is not that the system was secretly designed for harm. The horror is that it was designed for access, and access always has a threshold. To understand that threshold, we have to move from the civic idea to the legal door that held it open. The legal threshold was not hidden in a haunted station log or an unmarked cassette. It was written into communications policy. It belonged to the ordinary world of franchises, city authority, cable systems, and public rights-of-way. If the previous chapter was about what local access was built to let in, this one is about how that opening became durable enough to matter. The key statute in this part of the history is the Cable Communications Policy Act of 1984. Its importance is not that it invented the desire for community television from nothing. Local access had older roots, and cable systems were already being shaped by local agreements. But the Act gave the structure a clearer legal place. It amended the Communications Act so that franchising authorities could require channel capacity for public, educational, or governmental use. It also allowed those authorities to require support for PEG use, including facilities, equipment, or financial support. That is the legal door left open. Not a secret door. Not a forbidden door. Not a door built by villains. A civic door. A municipal door. A door that says, if a cable operator uses local infrastructure and serves a local community, the local franchising authority may insist that some part of the system be reserved for public purposes. The channel does not have to belong entirely to the operator's own programming vision. A portion of the cable system can be obligated toward the town, the school, the city meeting, the library notice, the public service announcement, the amateur producer, the person who has something local to say, and no other screen on which to say it. In policy language, this is about localism. A Congressional Research Service report described PEG channels as a United States media policy tool for localism. That word can sound dry until we translate it into the room where the television is actually playing. Localism means the image on the screen does not always arrive from far away. It can come from the council chamber down the road. It can come from a school auditorium. It can come from a community access center with borrowed cameras and a training schedule. It can come from a small institution that would never be carried by a national network because the intended audience is too narrow, too specific, too close to home. The Cable Communications Policy Act of 1984 matters because it helped make that closeness enforceable. It gave local franchising authorities a recognized role in requiring channel capacity for PEG use. It supported the idea that access was not merely a courtesy that a cable operator might extend when convenient. It could be part of the franchise relationship itself. That relationship is important to the horror of this story because it is not theatrical. It is administrative. A franchise agreement is not a cursed object. A channel set-aside is not a seance. Support for equipment and facilities is not a ritual. But each of these ordinary mechanisms helps explain how local material reaches private homes with relatively little centralized gatekeeping. They create a route. They create a place in the channel lineup where the town can appear. And a route is all an analog nightmare needs. The imagined funeral tape depends on a very particular kind of plausibility. It would not feel the same if it appeared on a major broadcast network in prime time, surrounded by national advertising and corporate oversight. It would not feel the same if it were only a home movie sealed in a box. The public access setting is unsettling because it sits between those worlds. It is public, but not always polished. It is official enough to arrive through the cable system, but local enough that the production may look like it came from a church basement, a municipal hall, or a borrowed studio. It may be scheduled, labeled, and transmitted, yet still feel under-examined. That ambiguity is not a failure of the civic idea. It is the consequence of making room. The law did not say, in some sinister voice, that strange ceremonies should be placed before sleeping households. It said that franchising authorities could require capacity and support for public, educational, and governmental access. It recognized that channels could be used for public access, educational access, governmental access, and related institutional purposes. It treated cable not only as a commercial entertainment pipe, but as something passing through communities and therefore answerable, in part, to community needs. This is why the door metaphor matters. A door can be necessary and still frightening at night. A town hall must have doors. A library must have doors. A public meeting must have doors. Democracy requires openings, places where ordinary people, local institutions, and minor records can pass from private concern into public view. But every opening changes the feeling of a house. It means something can enter that did not originate with the central authority. It means the screen in the living room is not only a receiver for distant professionals, it is also a window facing the neighborhood. In daylight, that window is reassuring. It shows the zoning board. It shows school district events. It shows parades, public notices, municipal hearings, lectures, and local productions. It proves that the community has not disappeared inside national media. It gives small events a place to be seen. At night, the same window can become difficult to read. The fear is not that the Cable Communications Policy Act of 1984 created a monster. That would be too easy, and it would be false. The act is better understood as part of the legal scaffolding for access, a way for local franchising authorities to require that cable systems provide channel capacity and support for PEG use. Its historical importance lies in making community media less dependent on pure operator preference. It made local access part of the regulated cable environment, not just a favor. But horror often lives inside legitimate systems, not outside them. Inside the proper form, inside the approved route, inside the mechanism that exists for good reasons. A false document is frightening in one way. A real form filled out incorrectly is frightening in another. A pirate signal is frightening because it breaks into the system. A local access program is frightening because under the right conditions, it may not look like a break-in at all. It may look like the channel doing what it was meant to do, carrying local material to local subscribers. That is the quiet turn. If a funeral-like program appeared on a PEG channel in an analog horror fiction, the first chill would not necessarily come from a scream, a ghost, or a distorted face. It would come from normal presentation, a title card, a schedule slot, a community bulletin, a camera fixed too long on a lectern or a coffin or a framed portrait. The terror would be increased, not reduced, by the channel's ordinariness. Viewers would know that this was the place where small civic things appeared. They would have been trained by repetition to accept local footage as local fact. And if the names on the screen belonged to people still alive, the screen would suddenly feel less like entertainment and more like a record that had gotten ahead of reality. The legal history does not prove that such a broadcast occurred. It does something narrower and more useful for this archive report. It explains why the setting has weight. PEG channels were not imaginary back alleys of television. They were part of a policy structure. They were supported by the idea that local franchising authorities could require capacity and resources for public, educational, and governmental use. They were connected to a larger argument about who gets to speak through a cable system when that system depends on the community it serves. That argument is generous. It is also unstable in the way all open systems are unstable. The more a channel is meant to receive ordinary local content, the less it resembles a sealed broadcast tower. It becomes a threshold. People cross it with meeting tapes, school programs, public announcements, training projects, institutional recordings, and ceremonies. Most of what crosses is harmless. Much of it is valuable. Some of it is boring in the deeply human way local records are boring. But the threshold remains. The nightmare image of a public access funeral for living people takes that threshold seriously. It does not require the law to be malicious. It only requires the law to have made space. It only requires a channel designed for access, a community accustomed to seeing itself there, and a transmission that arrives with the calm authority of something scheduled. That calm authority is where the next problem begins. Once a channel exists for public use, once capacity and support have been required, once the civic door is open, the question becomes more delicate. Who stands at the doorway, and what are they allowed to stop? Because access is not the same as chaos. PEG systems can have rules. They can have procedures. They can have training requirements, production standards, and schedules. But the central tension remains. A public access channel is most itself when it is not controlled like an ordinary commercial channel. The blank screen is available. The slot is waiting. The tape is labeled. The operator may not be the one who decides what the community is allowed to say. And in that small gap between permission and control, the room gets darker. The darkness in that gap is not the darkness of a lawless room. It is the more ordinary darkness of a room where the rules are real but limited. Someone has the key. Someone has the schedule. Someone knows which deck plays into the channel and which monitor shows the outgoing feed. But that does not mean someone is supposed to sit in judgment over every sentence, every image, every local ritual that reaches the screen. That is the central tension of public access. The channel is not simply open because no one thought to close it. It is open because public access was built around a specific civic promise. The promise was that ordinary people, local institutions, and community groups could use a portion of the cable system without being filtered through the same editorial machinery as commercial television. The cable operator might own or manage pieces of the system. The local franchising authority might impose obligations through the franchise. A public access center might handle training, equipment, and scheduling. But the spirit of the arrangement depends on the idea that the channel is not just another controlled outlet. This is where the legal architecture becomes strangely intimate. It does not only shape what city councils and cable companies can negotiate. It shapes what a viewer might see at home, late at night, while passing through channels that are not trying to sell anything, not trying to entertain a national audience, not trying to polish themselves into certainty. Public access has always carried a different texture. The room on screen might be fluorescent. The audio might be uneven. The camera might drift slightly. A title card might be made with the tools available, not the tools preferred. That roughness is not incidental. It is part of the access. And because it is access, the operator's control is not supposed to be the same as editorial control. The research record puts the point plainly. Cable operators generally may not control the content of public access programming. There is an exception, but it is narrow and serious. A cable operator may refuse programming that it reasonably believes contains obscenity. That exception matters because it shows that the system was never imagined as a place with no boundary at all. There is a line. But outside that line, the cable operator is not meant to become the taste committee, the theology board, the political referee, or the neighborhood censor. For horror, this is more unsettling than a simple absence of rules. If there were no rules, the fear would be obvious. Chaos explains itself. But public access is not chaos. It is structured openness. It is a civic channel with forms, procedures, calendars, equipment policies, and expectations. It can look official without being centrally authored. It can feel approved without having been approved in the way a viewer might assume. That distinction is where the blank screen becomes powerful. A blank slot on a schedule does not look frightening in an office. It is just time to be assigned. A blank screen on a channel does not look frightening in a technical manual. It is just absence. But in a home, at night, a blank screen is a waiting surface. It is an invitation for the signal to return. When it does, the viewer does not necessarily know whether the program has been reviewed, sponsored, mistaken, submitted, repeated, inherited from an archive, or loaded by someone who is only responsible for making sure the tape plays. The viewer sees the channel number. The viewer sees the local character of the image. The viewer sees the calm authority of cable television. And that can be enough to make even a strange transmission feel as if it has passed through some invisible civic hand. That assumption is not always fair to the system. PEG-YO use rules can exist, and the Federal Communications Commission's guidance identifies several kinds. Time may be allocated among competing applicants on a content-neutral basis. That phrase, content neutral, is important. It means the system can manage scarcity without deciding whose message is better, safer, more acceptable, or more comforting. If two people want the same time, there can be a scheduling rule. If the channel has only so many hours, there can be a queue. If the equipment is shared, there can be procedures. But those mechanisms are not supposed to become a hidden editorial filter. A public access center might also require minimum production standards. That sounds mundane, and it is. It may mean the program has to be technically usable. It may mean the audio should be intelligible enough, the video stable enough, the format compatible enough, the material prepared in a way that does not break the channel's normal operation. These standards are not the same as saying the program must be tasteful, cheerful, professionally lit, or emotionally easy to watch. They are closer to the requirements of a doorway. The tape has to fit through. The signal has to hold. The program has to be capable of being shown. Training requirements may also apply. A person using cameras, editing equipment, playback systems, or studio facilities may need to learn how to use them. Again, the rule sounds reassuring. Training means someone has been in the building. Someone has signed in, listened, practiced, touched the controls under supervision. But training also means the tools of transmission can be distributed. It means the ability to make local television does not remain confined to career broadcasters. It moves outward, into the hands of residents, volunteers, organizations, schools, churches, activists, hobbyists, and people with one message they believe must be seen. That was the point. The horror version does not need to invent a secret conspiracy inside the Access Center. It only has to look carefully at what openness requires. A public access channel must be porous enough to serve its purpose. It must allow local material to enter. It must avoid turning every decision into content control. It must be able to say yes to the unfamiliar, because the familiar already has other places to go. So imagine, not as a confirmed case, but as the shape of the fear, a program submitted with ordinary paperwork. A memorial title, a local name, a date, a quiet room, a camera fixed on chairs, flowers, framed portraits, a lectern, maybe a coffin or something arranged to look like one. Nothing about that image by itself proves a crime. Nothing about the existence of a funeral-like program proves the subject is dead. Later chapters will show why that distinction matters. Living funerals are real ritual forms, and modern systems can sometimes mark the living incorrectly. But even before those facts enter the frame, the channel's structure has already created the vulnerability. The cable operator is not there to decide that grief looks too strange. The access center is not necessarily there to decide that a ritual is too private. The scheduling rule, if it is content neutral, is not there to ask whether the viewer will sleep afterward. And the viewer, sitting at home, may not understand any of this. Most viewers do not watch local access with a copy of communications policy beside them. They do not parse the difference between operator control, franchising authority obligations, and user-submitted programming. They see what appears. They receive it as television. And television, especially local television, has a way of laundering uncertainty into fact. If it is on the channel, if it has a lower third title, if it begins on the hour, if the sound rises and the image holds, it feels less like a rumor and more like a record. That is why the imagined funeral tape is disturbing, even without confirmation as a real incident. It lives inside a documented tension. The system is designed to permit public use, but the home viewer experiences the result as an official-looking signal. The operator's limited control protects speech and access, but that same limitation can make the screen feel undefended. Rules can govern scheduling, training, and production quality, but rules about process do not guarantee emotional safety. A channel can be functioning correctly and still show something that feels impossible. The blank screen, then, is not empty because no one cares. It is empty because a public system has left room for the public to arrive. There is a democratic dignity in that. It matters. Without it, a community channel would become only a bulletin board for approved institutions, a narrow municipal window, a softer version of control. Public access depends on the uncomfortable belief that local people can speak, gather, record, explain, mourn, argue, teach, perform, and testify without first becoming professionals. Its strangeness is tied to its value. But analog horror often begins with valuable systems. A baby monitor exists to keep a child safe. An emergency alert exists to warn the public. An archive exists to preserve memory. A public access channel exists to let a community see and hear itself. The nightmare begins when the function remains intact, but the meaning shifts. The monitor carries a voice no one recognizes. The alert says something impossible. The archive keeps a record no one remembers making. The access channel shows the community something it cannot place. Public access, in that sense, is not frightening because it is broken. It is frightening because it may be working exactly as designed. It may accept the program. It may schedule the time. It may meet the production standard. It may play the tape. And if the material is not reasonably believed to contain obscenity, the cable operator's role may not be to stop it simply because it is unsettling. That restraint is not a loophole in the civic idea. It is part of the civic idea. The public has access because someone with control is not allowed to use that control too broadly. So the question becomes less dramatic and more chilling. Not who let this happen, but what kind of system makes letting things happen a public good? To answer that honestly, we need to leave the abstract channel and enter a real local room, not a cursed station, not a rumor. A named community media operation with a long memory, a place where ordinary coverage and local production are not hypothetical. In Stoughton, Wisconsin, one such signal says it began in 1968 and describes itself as the oldest continually operating community cable channel in the United States. There, the theory of access becomes something with cameras, meetings, parades, school events, citizens, and a town watching itself over time. If the earlier chapters describe the shape of the doorway, WSTO-TV gives us a room on the other side. Not a mythical room, not a station invented to make the premise easier. A real community media operation in Stoughton, Wisconsin, with a public story that reaches back to 1968. WSTO-TV says it first went on the air that year and describes itself as the oldest continually operating community cable channel in the United States. That claim matters here not because it proves anything sinister. It does not. It matters because it gives the abstract system a body. The policy language about localism becomes a camera pointed at a meeting room. The channel capacity becomes a schedule. The promise of public access becomes a place where citizens can produce content for broadcast and web viewing. This is where the nightmare becomes quieter. A long-running community channel is not frightening because it is hidden. It is frightening, in the analog sense, because it is so visible for so long that it begins to resemble public memory. Year after year, it records the kinds of things that rarely become national history. A city council meeting, a planning commission session, municipal court coverage, a school district event, a local gathering, a parade moving through the town in daylight. These are not spectacles in the commercial sense. They are civic evidence. They say, this person spoke, this board voted, this child performed, this street filled with people. This season came and went. WSTO TV's own description places it inside that everyday function. It is a public access media center. Citizens can produce content there. Their work can be shown on the channel and made available for web viewing. In the wider structure we have already been tracing, this is exactly what access was meant to make possible. Not a single central broadcaster deciding what a town is allowed to see, but a local mechanism through which the town can show itself to itself. And that phrase sounds harmless until you sit with it. A town showing itself to itself means that the ordinary boundaries between audience, subject, and producer become thin. The person watching a school district event may know the people on screen. The person watching a parade may have stood just outside the frame. The person speaking at a city council meeting may go home afterward and see their own face on the local channel. Unlike distant network television, community media does not always arrive from somewhere else. It may arrive from across town. It may show the room where your permit was discussed, the gym where your child sang, the street where your neighbor waved from a float. That intimacy is the reason community access has civic value. It is also the reason analog horror keeps returning to local signals. A national broadcast can be terrifying because it is powerful. A local broadcast can be terrifying because it is personal. WSTO TV's long continuity sharpens that point. 1968 is not just an old date on a station biography. It places the channel deep inside the era when cable television was still becoming part of ordinary American media life. It suggests a signal that has persisted across changes in equipment, formats, schedules, storage, and viewer habits. A channel that began in 1968 would have passed through a world of analog cameras, playback decks, local cable lineups, municipal rooms, school auditoriums, and eventually web viewing. The research notes do not require us to invent the technical contents of WSTO's shelves, and we should not. But the fact of long operation is enough. Duration itself creates unease. The longer a local signal runs, the more it gathers. It gathers faces. It gathers voices. It gathers dates that were important only locally. It gathers the posture of public life, people leaning into microphones, officials shuffling papers, students waiting for their names to be called, spectators standing along parade routes, cameras holding steady while nothing dramatic appears to happen. In a horror story built around a public access funeral tape, those ordinary images are the credible ground. The impossible tape does not feel as if it came from a network studio. It feels as if it came from a place like this, a community media center, a room with a schedule, a long memory, and a habit of making local life viewable. Again, the point is not that WSTO TV did anything like the event imagined in our title. No reliable source confirms a real public access station deliberately broadcast a funeral for people still alive. That remains the boundary of this report. But WSTO helps explain why the image is plausible enough to unsettle us. Public access is not just an idea about free expression. It is also a practical arrangement in which ordinary citizens, local institutions, and municipal life can become programming. If a town records meetings, school district events, local events, and parades, then the screen is already prepared to receive ceremonies. It is already prepared to treat civic time as broadcast material. A funeral, in that symbolic structure, is not a strange category of event. It is a community ceremony. It has a room, a program, a sequence, a camera angle. It has names, photographs, music, speeches, and a public meaning. What makes the nightmare wrong is not the form of the event. It is the status of the people named inside it. A funeral for someone who has died belongs to public grief. A funeral for someone still alive crosses into accusation, misidentification, rehearsal, or intrusion. It turns the access channel into a mirror that shows the town a false future. That is why the local example matters more than a fictional station would. WSTO-TV's stated role is ordinary and civic. Citizens can produce content for broadcast and web viewing. Local government and school district life can be covered. Public events can be preserved long enough to be watched beyond a moment itself. Nothing in that description is supernatural. Nothing in it implies malice. But horror does not always begin with malice. Sometimes it begins with a trusted mechanism doing exactly what it was built to do, while the content moving through it becomes unbearable. A community channel has a different emotional texture from a commercial one. Its scale is smaller, but its names are closer. Its production may be more modest, but its local authority is stronger. Viewers may forgive rough audio, fixed camera angles, uneven lighting, or long stretches of procedural speech because the channel is not selling polish. It is offering proximity. It is saying, this is your town, your meeting, your school, your parade. In the context of our imagined tape, that proximity becomes the source of dread. A funeral program appearing on such a channel would not feel like abstract entertainment. It would feel like a community notice. It would borrow the same visual grammar as real local coverage. It would not need dramatic music. It would only need a name that someone recognizes. A portrait, a date, a calm voice reading what should not be read. The more ordinary the channel, the more powerful the violation. This is also where the public access media center becomes important. The phrase does not describe a passive pipe. It describes a place where people can make media. The citizens are not only viewers, they can become producers. That is the promise. It is also the narrative pressure point. When a system is built to let local people speak, the identity of the speaker matters. Who submitted the program? Who labeled it? Who believed it was appropriate? Who scheduled it? Who watched it go out? The earlier chapter warned us not to confuse limited cable operator control with an absence of rules. Here, in a real community media setting, the question becomes less legal and more intimate. In a town-sized media ecosystem, every unknown hand feels close enough to have a name. And still, the strongest fact about WSTO-TV for this chapter may be its endurance. Continually operating. That phrase has a low mechanical hum. It implies persistence through decades of changing civic life. A channel that keeps operating becomes part of the background, like a municipal clock or a light over a doorway. People may not watch every day. They may not think about it until they need it. But it remains available, carrying the slow traffic of local record. Analog nightmares often depend on abandoned media, lost tapes, forgotten broadcasts. WSTO shows another possibility, the frightening power of media that was not abandoned at all.
It kept going. It kept covering.
It kept accepting the premise that local life deserves a channel. The old signal in the room is not scary because it is dead. It is scary because it is alive, and because it remembers ordinary things before anyone knows they will matter. That memory is the bridge we have been approaching. Broadcasts are supposed to pass. Meetings end. Parades turn the corner. School events empty into parking lots. A local program airs, then is replaced by the next one. But community media complicates that disappearance. A program can be recorded. It can be replayed. It can be made available for web viewing. It can move from a local schedule into a broader condition of preservation. Once that happens, the channel is no longer only a window. It becomes an archive in formation. And archives change the nature of fear. A strange broadcast is one kind of event when it flickers once at night and vanishes. It is another kind when it leaves a trace, when it enters a collection, when the local signal becomes part of a larger memory system. The oldest local signal in the room teaches us that community television is not merely ephemeral. It can last long enough for its ordinary footage to become historical evidence. It can last long enough for viewers to ask not only what aired, but what survived. The question left at the end of the last chapter was not only what a local channel can air. It was what happens after the airing is over. A town meeting can pass through a cable system and disappear into the ordinary night. A school concert can run once, then return only as a memory in the homes that happen to be tuned in. A parade can be recorded from a curb, captioned with the name of the town, and placed into rotation until the season changes. In that first life, community television is temporary. It belongs to the schedule. It belongs to the living pace of a place. But preservation gives it a second life. Once a local signal is saved, indexed, posted, collected, or described, it stops being only a broadcast. It becomes evidence that the broadcast occurred. It becomes something that can be revisited by people who were not there, who did not live in the town, who never saw the cable channel in its original form. The image loses some of its local warmth and gains another quality: distance. It can now be studied. That is where the horror premise begins to change shape. A strange program airing once on a public access channel is frightening because of its immediacy. You imagine someone sitting in a dark room, seeing a familiar channel interrupted by something that should not be there. The television is local. The names may be local. The faces may be recognizable. The fear is intimate. An archived strange program is frightening for a different reason. It has survived its moment. It has passed from the soft, unstable world of reception into the harder world of records. It can be cataloged. It can be compared. It can be discovered years later by someone with no memory of the night it aired. The Library of Congress gives us a factual way to understand that passage from signal to record. Its public broadcasting web archive includes websites associated with United States public broadcasting entities. The collection is not the same thing as the full world of public access, and it should not be treated as proof of our central rumor. It does not confirm that a community channel ever deliberately broadcast a funeral for people who are still alive. The archive matters here for a quieter reason. It shows that public media, including the web presence around public radio and public television, can become part of a national preservation system. That detail is easy to pass over. It should not be. Local media often feels temporary by design. It is made for a place, a schedule, a narrow audience, and a moment. It may not announce itself as history. It may not even think of itself as history. A public broadcaster's website might carry program pages, station information, schedules, local stories, educational material, community updates, or institutional traces of what the station believed it was doing at the time. Some of that material may feel routine. Some may feel disposable. But routine material is exactly what archives often need, because it shows the ordinary systems around the extraordinary event. An archive does not preserve only the dramatic center of a story. It preserves edges. It preserves context. It preserves names of institutions, descriptions of programming, public language, and evidence of how an organization presented itself to its audience. In an analog nightmare, that is where the tape becomes more dangerous. Not because the archive invents a monster, but because it refuses to let the ordinary room vanish. The Library of Congress says the collection period for the Public Broadcasting Web Archive began in May 2019 and is ongoing.
That phrase, "and is ongoing," has a particular weight. It means the collection is not merely a closed cabinet of old broadcasting history. It is a continuing act of memory.
It is a system still gathering traces, still extending the shelf, still turning public media's present tense into future evidence. For our purposes, May 2019 becomes a hinge date. Not because anything supernatural happened then. Not because it marks the beginning of public broadcasting, public access, or community television.
It does none of those things.
It matters because it marks a documented collection period in which a major public institution began and continues to preserve websites associated with United States public broadcasting entities. It gives the episode a factual bridge between fleeting local media and permanent archival memory.
That bridge is essential.
The earlier chapters have kept us close to the cable channel itself, the public right-of-way, the local franchise, the set-aside channel, the community media room, the rules that permit access without making the cable operator the editor of every image. Those details explain how unusual local programming can plausibly reach a viewer. But they do not explain what happens after the signal has passed. Archives explain that. The Library of Congress also states that the Public Broadcasting Web Archive complements the American Archive of Public Broadcasting. That second archive is described as a collaboration between the Library of Congress and GBH in Boston. There is something important in the word complements. It does not suggest a single container holding every possible broadcast trace. It suggests a larger preservation landscape, with different collections holding different kinds of evidence. One collection may hold web material associated with public broadcasting entities. Another preservation effort may center on audiovisual public broadcasting materials. Together, they create a wider field of memory around public media in the United States. They make it harder for a local or institutional media life to pass entirely out of reach. Again, this is not proof of the fictional tape. It is the architecture around why such a tape would feel possible to search for. If someone tells you that a disturbing program aired once on a forgotten community channel, the first instinct is to imagine a dead end.
The broadcast was temporary.
The station was small.
The equipment was old.
The tape was reused. The schedule was lost. The person who ran the playback deck retired. The building changed hands. The website was redesigned. The page disappeared. All of that can be true, but preservation interrupts disappearance. It says, not always. Sometimes the page was captured. Sometimes the program description survived. Sometimes the organization's self-description remains. Sometimes a name, a date, a series title, or a station history can be recovered long after the original viewer has stopped trusting their own memory. That is why archives are both reassuring and unsettling. They promise order, but they also expand responsibility. A rumor without records can be dismissed as fog. A rumor with surrounding records becomes harder to ignore, even if the center remains unverified. The absence of the exact tape does not erase the documented systems around it. It only leaves a shaped emptiness. And a shaped emptiness is one of the basic forms of archival horror. You do not need to claim that the Library of Congress preserved a forbidden funeral broadcast. The research does not support that claim. What the research supports is more restrained and in some ways more durable. Public broadcasting entities produce digital traces. National institutions collect some of those traces. The collection period began in May 2019 and continues. The Public Broadcasting Web Archive complements the American Archive of Public Broadcasting, a collaboration between the Library of Congress and GBH in Boston. Those facts are enough to change how the nightmare breathes. The frightening object is no longer just a tape placed in the wrong slot. It is a tape in relation to a system of memory. It is a local broadcast imagined against institutions designed to keep public media from dissolving completely. It is the idea that some ordinary community signal, something meant for a narrow audience and a passing hour, might one day be approached like an artifact. At that point, even the innocent material becomes strange. A public television website, a schedule page, a station history, a community program description, English and Spanish collection material, the institutional names themselves, Library of Congress, GBH, American Archive of Public Broadcasting. They do not belong to the same atmosphere as a dark living room and a late-night cable channel, yet they complete the path from one to the other. The private act of watching becomes a public act of remembering. This is the moment when the invented funeral tape stops being only a broadcast legend and becomes an archival question. What would its surrounding records look like? Would there be a program listing? A mislabeled web page? A station calendar that used the word memorial when it meant something else? Would a viewer remember a coffin while the institution recorded a community wellness event? Would the title survive while the tape did not? Or would the tape survive without enough context to explain why the people named in it were not dead? The archive does not answer those questions for us. It only teaches us to ask them with more precision. And precision matters because the next part of the story turns on a detail that sounds invented until it is placed back into the world. A funeral does not always mean that the person at the center of the ritual has died. In some places, under specific circumstances, people have rehearsed death while still alive. They have worn shrouds, written wills, faced funeral portraits, and entered coffins not as corpses, but as participants. Once that fact enters the room, the image changes again. The impossible broadcast becomes less impossible. Not confirmed, not proven, but closer to a documented human practice than the title first allowed us to believe. The archive made the fear more precise. It moved the question away from the impossible version, where a station invents death out of nothing, and towards something quieter. What if the ceremony was real, but the conclusion was wrong? What if the visual grammar of a funeral appeared on a screen, complete with portraits, shrouds, wills, and coffins, while the people inside the ritual were still alive? That is the threshold this chapter has to cross carefully. Because the phrase living funeral can sound like a horror invention, it sounds as if it belongs to a late-night tape label or to a story told about a broadcast that no one can find anymore. It seems at first too convenient. The funeral without the corpse, the coffin without the death, the audience asked to mourn people who might still be watching from home. But living funerals are not merely an analog horror device. They are a documented ritual form. Reuters reported in 2019 from Seoul, South Korea, on mass living funeral services at Hyo Healing Center. According to that report, more than 25,000 people had participated in those services since the center opened in 2012. That number matters because it removes the practice from the category of isolated rumor. This was not described as one eccentric ceremony, one private family ritual, or one unverified anecdote drifting through a message board. Reuters described repeated services, many participants, and a named center in a real city. The horror image, then, does not begin with fabrication. It begins with documentation. At Haiwan Healing Center, Reuters described participants wearing shrouds. They wrote wills. They faced funeral portraits. They lay inside coffins. For around 10 minutes, those coffins were closed. Each element matters because each one belongs to the recognizable language of death. A shroud changes the body before death has occurred. A funeral portrait turns the living face into a memorial object. A will asks a person to imagine the world continuing without them. A coffin creates a boundary that, in ordinary life, most people cross only once, and not by choice. In a living funeral, those signs are deliberately rearranged. The participant is not dead. The ceremony is not evidence that the person has died. The ritual is a confrontation with mortality, a structured rehearsal in which death is staged while consciousness remains present. But if you remove that explanation, if you strip away the context and leave only the footage, the meaning becomes unstable. That instability is the heart of the public access nightmare. A local channel does not need to announce itself with dramatic music to become frightening. It only needs to show something that viewers understand too quickly and too incompletely. A static camera, a row of coffins, portraits placed where memorial portraits usually go, people dressed for burial, someone reading from a page that resembles a final statement, a lid being lowered. If the viewer does not know the practice, the image seems to report death. If the viewer does know the practice, the image becomes more complicated, not less. It becomes a scene where the living borrow the forms of the dead. Reuters' reporting is useful here because it gives the nightmare its limits. The Seoul living funeral services were not described as supernatural events. The participants were not presented as ghosts, revenants, or victims of a hidden broadcast. They were people taking part in a ritual at a specific center in a specific city as part of a service that had drawn more than 25,000 participants over several years. The details were physical, ordinary, and stark. Shrouds, wills, portraits, coffins, and a period of roughly 10 minutes enclosed inside. That is enough. Horror often becomes weaker when it reaches too quickly for the impossible. The stronger fear is sometimes the one that keeps its hands on the documented world. A coffin does not need to be haunted to be frightening. A closed lid does not need to move on its own. A funeral portrait does not need to blink. The terror is already present in the ritual act, a living person agreeing to be treated, briefly and symbolically, as someone who has left the world. And when that act is recorded, it changes again. The camera has no instinct for context. It captures surfaces. It records the shroud, but not the internal reason for wearing it. It records the portrait, but not the participant's intention. It records the coffin lid closing, but not necessarily the fact that it will open again around 10 minutes later. A camera can preserve a ritual while weakening the explanation that makes it legible. This is why the archive matters. A description in a written report can tell us that the people were alive, that they were participating voluntarily in a living funeral service, that the coffins were closed for around 10 minutes. But a recovered tape might not carry all of that information. It might begin late. It might lose its opening remarks. It might preserve only the most alarming portion, the bodies in shrouds, the portraits, the documents, the coffins. If such footage were placed on a public access schedule without explanation, the channel itself would become part of the misunderstanding. Not because public access is sinister, but because public access can feel unusually close to life. It is not a distant network feed with polished framing and familiar hosts. It is local, procedural, sometimes underproduced, often direct. Its images can carry the texture of town halls, school events, civic meetings, memorials, and ordinary rooms. That ordinariness makes the intrusion of death language more powerful. The phrase funeral for people still alive therefore has two layers. One layer is the unconfirmed premise of this episode. No reliable source confirms that a real public access station deliberately broadcasts such a funeral as a documented incident. That remains the boundary. We do not cross it and pretend the tape has been proven. The second layer is factual. There are real ceremonies in which living people take on funeral forms. Reuters documented one such setting in Seoul. Since Hyowon Healing Center opened in 2012, more than 25,000 people had participated in mass living funeral services there by the time of the 2019 report. They wore shrouds. They wrote wills. They faced funeral portraits. They lay in coffins that were closed for around 10 minutes. Those facts do not prove the broadcast. They do something more unsettling for an archive report horror story. They make the broadcast structurally plausible as an image. They show that the central visual contradiction is not impossible. A funeral scene can exist without a death at its center. A coffin can contain a person who is still alive. A portrait can memorialize someone who has not died. A will can be written as an exercise rather than as an immediate legal farewell. The viewer's mistake would be understandable. Imagine finding only a segment, separated from its introduction. The tape begins after the explanation. The room is quiet. Participants sit before their own funeral portraits. The shrouds flatten individuality into ceremony. The wills are already written. A coffin waits for each person. Then the lids close. The camera does not panic. The camera does not explain. It simply watches, because that is what cameras do. For around 10 minutes, the line between ritual and report becomes thin. In person, the participants may know exactly what is happening. The organizers may know. The room may understand the timing, the purpose, and the intended return to life outside the coffin. But television creates another audience, one not present when the rules were stated. That audience receives signs without safeguards. It sees the evidence of death without the death itself. This is the quiet mechanism by which a healing ritual can become horror material when displaced into broadcast form. Not by changing the facts, but by changing the frame. Reuters' Cell report gives us the frame we need before we move closer.
Hiawan Healing Center is not a fictional mortuary invented for the sake of atmosphere. The living funeral service is not an urban legend invented to explain a cursed tape. It is a reported practice with repeated participation, ritual materials, and a documented structure. The fear belongs not to the center itself, but to the act of translation, from room to camera, from camera to archive, from archive to channel, from channel to a viewer who does not know whether they are watching metaphor or obituary. And once that distinction has been loosened, the details begin to ask for names. Not anonymous figures in shrouds, not abstract participants, but people who entered the ritual as themselves. A university student, an elderly participant, the head of the center, a city, a room in Seoul where the rehearsal of death was treated not as a ghost story, but as a human confrontation with being alive. The previous chapter left us at the threshold of a room in Seoul, with the image no longer safely abstract. A living funeral is easy to treat as a phrase, almost too neat, almost designed for the language of horror. But the Reuters report gives it weight in a different way. It places the practice at Hiawan Healing Center in Seoul, South Korea. It identifies Jong Yong-mun as the head of the center. It names participants who were not symbols, not extras in an invented nightmare, but people who entered the ceremony from ordinary life. That change matters. Horror often depends on a blur, on a face hidden by static or a name lost to tape damage. Research does the opposite. It sharpens. It tells us that Choi Jin-kyu, described by Reuters as a 28-year-old university student, was among the participants. It tells us that Cho Jae-hee, 75, was also there. These details do not make the ritual supernatural. They make it human. They move the image away from a haunted set and toward an actual social practice, one that used the shape of a funeral to bring living people into contact with the thought of their own deaths. That is why the Seoul case is so important to this archive report. It does not prove that any public access station broadcast a funeral for people still alive. It does not confirm the central urban nightmare as an event. What it does confirm is more unsettling in a quieter way. There are documented circumstances in which living people have worn shrouds, faced funeral portraits, written wills, and lain inside coffins. There are documented circumstances in which a room full of the living has been arranged to resemble a room for the dead. At Hiawan Healing Center, according to Reuters, the ritual belonged to a stated practice of confrontation. More than 25,000 people had participated in mass living funeral services there since the center opened in 2012. The report described a sequence with physical objects that would be immediately legible to a viewer, even without context. Shrouds, coffins, portraits, written wills, a closed lid, a period of around 10 minutes inside the coffin. These materials carry meaning before anyone explains them. A shroud is not just cloth. A coffin is not just a container. A funeral portrait is not just an image. On a screen, especially on a low-resolution community channel, they become a grammar. The viewer does not need a narrator to understand that the scene is speaking in the language of death. And that is where the horror of mistranslation begins. Inside the documented ritual, the point is not that the participants are dead. The point is that they are alive enough to rehearse the idea of not being alive. The ritual asks them to enter a symbolic ending and return from it. It is a confrontation with mortality, not a supernatural claim. It belongs to the same broad human category as writing a will, visiting a grave, sitting with a terminal diagnosis, or standing quietly at a memorial and realizing that the name on the stone could one day be your own. It is an encounter with limit. It is not evidence of ghosts. But analog horror does not need ghosts when it has context collapse. The wrong image in the wrong channel, slot, can do what no apparition has to do. It can make the viewer misread the living as dead. Imagine the scene transferred from the room in Seoul to a television broadcast, stripped of explanation. Not because Reuters said that happened. It did not. Not because Hiawan Healing Center is being accused of anything hidden or occult. It is not. The fear comes from the mechanics of viewing. A camera records shrouded participants. It pauses on a portrait. It catches a hand adjusting paper. It frames a coffin lid descending. Then the footage appears elsewhere, perhaps late at night, perhaps without a lower third caption, perhaps with the original title card missing,
perhaps on a channel whose usual programming is town meetings, school events, parades, and civic notices.
To someone who knows the practice,
The scene may read as ritual therapy, symbolic rehearsal, a social exercise in mortality.
to someone who does not, it may read as a funeral.
And if the participants are later identified by name, the mistake deepens.
Choi Jin-kyu, 28. Cho Jae-hee, 75.
The ordinary power of names turns a symbolic ceremony into what looks like an announcement. This is the point at which the public access nightmare becomes plausible as a feeling, even while remaining unverified as a documented incident. Public access and community channels have always carried the aura of locality.
They feel close. They feel less mediated than national television.
A national broadcast may tell you about strangers. A local channel may show you a person you recognize from the grocery store, a school auditorium, a municipal hearing, a church basement, or a parade route. The screen is smaller in authority, but larger in intimacy. If a living funeral image appears there without context, the viewer is not watching an exotic ritual at a safe distance. The viewer is watching something that appears to have been accepted into the machinery of local record.
That is different.
It suggests that someone scheduled it, or failed to stop it, or copied it from a tape, or labeled it incorrectly, or placed it in a slot where a memorial was expected.
The fear does not require malice.
A mislabeled cassette can be enough. A missing introduction can be enough. A broadcast log with the wrong wording can be enough. The Seoul details intensify this because they are precise. Hyaewon Healing Center is not a mood. Seoul is not an unnamed city. Jung Yong-mun is not an anonymous functionary. Reuters did not describe a rumor passed from forum to forum. It reported on a center, a practice, a head of that center, and participants. The precision resists the fictional impulse to let everything dissolve into static. It says, this part is real. People have done this. They have climbed into coffins alive. For horror, that may be more powerful than invention. A made-up funeral for the living can be dismissed as a writer's trick. A documented living funeral service cannot be dismissed in the same way.
It must be understood. It must be placed in context.
It must be allowed to mean what its participants and organizers meant it to mean, rather than what a frightened viewer might project onto it. And yet the frightened projection remains available, waiting at the edge of the frame. That edge is where analog nightmares often live. They do not always fabricate entire worlds. They rearrange real ones. They take a civic channel designed for access and set it beside a ritual designed for reflection. They take a documented confrontation with mortality and remove the sentence that says the people in the coffins are expected to emerge. They take a funeral portrait and make it behave like an obituary. They take the silence of a closed coffin and let the viewer supply the worst possible explanation. The 10 minutes inside the coffin, as Reuters described it, is especially difficult to translate cleanly to television. In the room, 10 minutes can be supervised, intentional, and bounded by ritual. On tape, 10 minutes can feel abandoned. The camera does not necessarily communicate consent. It does not necessarily show the moment before or the moment after. It may preserve the lid, the stillness, the dark shape of the box, and nothing else. If that footage is separated from its purpose, the duration becomes oppressive. It stops being a passage through reflection and begins to resemble evidence. This is why the chapter has to remain careful. The living funeral at Hyaewon Healing Center should not be treated as a cursed ceremony. The people named in the report should not be turned into victims of an event that the sources do not support. Choi Jin-kyu and Cho Jae-hee appear here because Reuters named them as participants in a real practice, not because they belong to a ghost story. Jung Yong-mun appears here because Reuters identified him as the head of the center, not because he is a villain in the imagined broadcast. The horror is not located in them. It is located in the viewer's uncertainty when ritual becomes footage, and footage becomes programming, and programming becomes an apparent public record. It is located in the cold administrative possibility that an image can survive after its explanation has been separated from it. It is located in the way television can flatten intention. On screen, a rehearsal of death and a record of death may share the same shapes. And once we understand that, Seoul becomes more than a single documented case. It becomes one point in a wider map of living funerals as public ritual, private confrontation, and cultural performance.
The same unsettling structure appears elsewhere with different atmosphere, different music, and a different kind of audience.
Not a mass service in a healing center, but a reported gathering in Tokyo.
Not anonymous coffins in a room,
But a portrait, flowers, prayers, and hundreds of attendees gathered before a birthday that had not yet arrived.
From Seoul, the map does not become simpler. It becomes more delicate.
The Coffin rehearsal at Hyewon Healing Center gave us one form of the living funeral, structured, instructional, almost therapeutic in the way Reuters described it.
Participants wore shrouds. They wrote wills. They faced funeral portraits.
They lay inside closed coffins for around 10 minutes.
The ritual made death visible while keeping the people involved alive, named and present. Tokyo gives us another form.
Here, the reported setting is not a mass program in a healing center.
It is a hotel. It is a gathering with guests.
It is an altar arranged with flowers.
It is music, portraiture,
Prayer and ceremony gathered around one public figure before a birthday.
A 2024 article
About entertainer Mizunoe Takiko reported that 500 people gathered at the Tokyo Hotel in Tokyo on February 19, 1993.
The event was described as her living funeral. It took place the day before her 78th birthday. That date matters.
In a conventional obituary structure, the date would be part of a closing line.
Birth, work, death, memorial.
The record would place a person's life between two fixed points and then describe who came to mourn after the end.
But this ceremony, as reported, interrupts that order. It is placed not after death,
but before a birthday.
Not at the end of the counted years,
but at the edge of another one.
The horror in that detail is quiet,
because it does not require anything supernatural.
It only asks the calendar to behave strangely.
February 19th becomes not a date of death, but a rehearsal date, a ceremonial threshold.
February 20th
waits just beyond it, carrying the 78th birthday that had not yet arrived.
The funeral form comes first. The birthday comes after.
For an archive, that is exactly the kind of inversion that can become dangerous when stripped of explanation.
Imagine a program log that only says funeral. Imagine a local tape label written by hand.
Imagine a community broadcast that captures a portrait, an altar, prayers, and 500 attendees in a Tokyo hotel ballroom.
If the explanatory phrase living funeral
is lost, mistranslated, cut from the beginning, or never recorded at all, the remaining images do what funeral images always do.
They declare absence. They teach the viewer how to look. They say, this person is gone.
But in the reported case of Mizunoe Takiko, the premise was that she was not gone.
The ceremony was living.
That word has to carry a great deal of weight.
The 2024 article,
as summarized in the research record, describes an atmosphere that was formally recognizable as funerary.
There was a portrait. There was a flower-adorned altar. There was Chopin. There were Gregorian chants.
There were Russian religious hymns. There were prayers from multiple traditions. Each of those details changes the texture of the room.
A portrait at a funeral is not just a picture.
In many recorded ceremonies, and in the wider visual language of memorials, it becomes the person's representative presence.
It gives the room a face to gather around. It allows mourners, guests, and cameras to orient themselves.
On screen, a portrait can become even more absolute because television compresses space. The viewer does not necessarily see the social explanation, the conversations at the edge of the room, the knowledge shared by the attendees.
The viewer sees the face,
framed and still, and the arrangement around it.
A flower-adorned altar gives the image a second center.
It signals ceremony, reverence, offering. It also gives the camera something to hold when nothing is moving. Flowers on video can look both alive and already severed from life. They are fresh, arranged, beautiful, and temporary.
They are signs of care, but also signs of ending.
In the context of a living funeral, that tension is intentional. In the context of a mysterious broadcast, it becomes evidence without testimony.
Then there is the sound.
Chopin carries one cultural memory. Gregorian chants carry another. Russian religious hymns carry another. The reported presence of prayers from multiple traditions suggests not a single narrow liturgy, but a deliberately layered ceremonial atmosphere.
The effect, even in description,
Is of a room that does not belong wholly to one category.
it is public and intimate, secular and religious, theatrical and sincere, personal and formal. For a public entertainer, that complexity matters.
Mizunoe Takiko was not being described here as an anonymous participant in a private exercise.
The reported gathering involved 500 people.
That number gives the ceremony a public dimension. 500 people in a Tokyo hotel is not an accidental encounter. It is a crowd large enough to create social proof, large enough to make the event feel official, even if its meaning depends on understanding that the funeral was symbolic, anticipatory, or performed while the subject was alive.
This is where the episode's central fear begins to sharpen again. A living funeral is not a false funeral. It is not necessarily a mistake. It is not, by itself, a lie. It can be a ritual with its own meaning,
Chosen and staged under conditions that the participants understand.
the people in the room know the difference
Between mourning a death and acknowledging mortality before death.
The person being honored may know it most clearly of all, but television does not automatically preserve that understanding. Television preserves surfaces with tremendous power. A portrait, flowers, a hotel room, music, a crowd, a prayer, a program title, a date. These can outlive the spoken explanation that once made them coherent.
The archive can hold the shape of a ritual after its intention has evaporated.
That is why the Tokyo Report
Belongs in this investigation, even though it is not evidence of the impossible broadcast. It is evidence of something adjacent and unsettling, a real reported case in which the visual and ceremonial language of a funeral gathered around a living person in public in a major city before a milestone birthday.
It shows that the premise does not have to begin with malice. It can begin with ritual. It can begin with a person choosing
Or accepting a ceremony that lets the living hear what is usually said after they are no longer present.
There is a strange mercy in that idea. A living funeral can allow gratitude to be spoken directly. It can move praise, farewell,
Memory and prayer into the reach of the person who is usually absent from their own memorial.
it reverses one of death's cruelties.
That the dead do not hear the room fill with stories.
But in analog horror,
Mercy and dread often use the same image.
a camera looking at a portrait does not tell us whether the subject can still answer the telephone.
A hymn does not tell us whether the person honored will wake the next morning to a birthday.
Flowers do not explain whether the altar is memorial, theatrical, devotional, or symbolic. The frame withholds the distinction.
The broadcast asks the viewer to infer it.
And viewers infer from genre.
If a public access station, a community channel, or any local cable outlet were to air footage like this without context, the audience at home would not start with an academic category.
They would start with the grammar they know. Funeral music means someone died.
A portrait near flowers means someone died. Prayers before seated attendees means someone died.
If the person named is still alive, the contradiction does not immediately resolve. It becomes a disturbance.
That disturbance is the engine of the nightmare.
The Tokyo ceremony, as reported, also complicates the idea of privacy.
Seoul showed participants entering a ritual confrontation with mortality, but the reported Mizunoe gathering suggests a ceremonial audience of considerable size. 500 people means witnesses.
It means the event was not hidden in a sealed room.
It had a social presence before any tape, article, or later retelling preserved it.
A living funeral can be public
Enough to be remembered, documented, and circulated, while still depending on a precise understanding that a casual observer may not have.
The Tokyo Hotel in Tokyo becomes important for that reason. Not because it is haunted in the research record. Not because the notes claim anything supernatural occurred there. It matters because a hotel is a transitional space. People arrive, gather,
Dress formally, enter rooms prepared for events, and leave.
The room can host a banquet,
A conference, a wedding, a memorial.
It changes identity according to schedule. That kind of space is perfectly suited to the archive report nightmare because meaning is installed temporarily. Afterward, the room is reset. The chairs are moved. The flowers are removed. The sound system is packed away. Only the record remains, and the record can be incomplete.
A 2024 article looking back at a ceremony from 1993 already places us at a distance. The event is filtered through later reporting. We are not treating it as a live feed. We are treating it as a reported historical detail within the larger documented existence of living funerals in Japan and South Korea. The caution matters. This series is not claiming that a public access channel aired Mizunoe Takiko's living funeral. It is not claiming that this Tokyo gathering caused the fictional tape at the center of our investigation. It is showing the factual material from which such a tape could plausibly borrow its most disturbing feature. A funeral for someone still alive is not only an invented nightmare image. It has a reported cultural and ceremonial precedent. It can involve an altar. It can involve a portrait. It can involve music and prayer. It can involve hundreds of people. It can happen before a birthday, not after a death. Once that is established, the horror shifts again. The question is no longer whether anyone, anywhere, could stage such a thing. The record says yes, in specific documented or reported forms. The question becomes what happens when the record-keeping system around the person fails to understand the difference. Because a living funeral still depends on one essential protection. Everyone must know that the person is alive. The participants must know. The organizers must know. The article must know. The archive must know. The caption must know. The broadcast schedule must know. The file name must know. If that knowledge breaks at any point, the ceremony changes identity. Not in the room, perhaps. Not for the people who were there. But later, on paper, on a tape label, in a database entry, in a cable schedule, in the mind of a viewer who catches only the middle of the program. A ritual chosen by the living can become, through omission, a death notice. A symbolic farewell can become an apparent obituary. A portrait can become proof. Tokyo before the birthday gives us that unstable border. It shows a funeral form placed deliberately on the living side of the line. The next fear is what happens when the line is not ceremonial at all, but administrative. When the problem is no longer that a living person chose the imagery of death, but that a system chose death for them. The previous chapter left us at the point where a ceremony can be misread because its meaning depends on the label. A living funeral is not by itself a mistake. It is an intentional ritual placed on the living side of the line. But the line has to be carried forward by records. It has to survive the caption, the archive entry, the program guide, the person typing a name into a system after midnight. And that is where the fear changes shape. It is no longer a fear of a coffin used as a symbol. It is a fear of a form, a status field, a mistaken entry with the force of reality behind it. In analog horror, this is the moment when the tape does not need a ghost. It only needs an administrative fact to be wrong. The documented version of that fear appears in reporting far outside the language of folklore. The Associated Press reported in 2024 on a Kentucky man who had been mistakenly declared dead in 2021. The case became publicized years later, and the essential terror of it is plain even when described in the driest possible terms. Surgery was avoided, and the man was still alive when the case was publicized. That sentence does not behave like a campfire story. It behaves like a record that has split open. A man is declared dead. Medical actions are contemplated in the shadow of that declaration. Surgery is avoided. Later, the public account makes clear that the man was alive. The facts, as reported, do not require embellishment. They are disturbing because they belong to the world of forms, procedures, timing, and institutional trust. For this episode, that matters more than any invented corpse moving under a sheet. The premise we have been circling is not that a real public access station has been verified to have deliberately broadcast a funeral for people still alive. The research does not support that as a confirmed incident. The stronger, more honest horror is different. It is that several pieces of the nightmare are real on their own. Local channels can carry community material. Funeral-like rituals can be performed by living people. Signals can be strange, vulnerable, or wrongly trusted. And modern systems can, in documented cases, mark the living as dead. The Kentucky case belongs to that last category. It gives the nightmare its paperwork. Because a death declaration is not merely a phrase. It is a decision with consequences. It can determine what people believe is still possible. It can trigger actions, prevent actions, redirect actions.
It can move a person, in the eyes of a system, from patient to body, from present tense to past tense.
And once that shift happens, even briefly, everything around the person starts to behave as if the record is true. This is why the legal definition matters. Cornell's Wex summary of the Uniform Determination of Death Act gives the definition in terms that are stark, careful, and technical. Under that summary, death is defined by either irreversible cessation of circulatory and respiratory functions, or irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain, including the brainstem.
The important word is not just cessation. It is irreversible.
The definition is built to separate temporary failure from final loss. Circulation and respiration may stop in ways that medicine attempts to reverse. Brain function may be assessed under grave circumstances. The law, as summarized by Cornell's Wex, speaks in the language of irreversible cessation because death is not supposed to be a guess based on atmosphere, stillness, silence, or the appearance of a room. And yet the horror comes from the gap between definition and administration.
A definition can be precise. A system can still fail.
A law can insist on irreversibility. A form can still be completed incorrectly. A body can still be misclassified. A status can still be entered, repeated, copied, transmitted, and believed by people who were not present for the original decision. That is where our imaginary public access funeral tape becomes more plausible as a nightmare without becoming a confirmed event. Not because the facts prove that a station aired such a funeral. They do not. But because they prove the supporting anxiety, the living can be placed into the category of the dead by systems that are supposed to prevent exactly that. Think again about the tape label. In earlier chapters, a living funeral depended on context. Seoul had its setting, Hyoan Healing Center, and the ritual described by Reuters: shrouds, written wills, funeral portraits, coffins, and a period inside closed coffins lasting around 10 minutes. Tokyo had the reported gathering for Mizunoe Takiko at the Tokyo Hotel, with hundreds of attendees, music, prayers, flowers, and a portrait before a birthday that had not yet arrived. In those cases, the living status of the participants was not incidental. It was the point. But imagine the recording separated from its explanation. Imagine a cassette or a local master tape logged without the word living. Imagine a schedule slot that says funeral service and then a surname. Imagine an archive record that drops the ceremony's purpose and preserves only its imagery. Now add the deeper fear from the Associated Press report. A system is capable of saying dead when the person is not. At that point, the horror is not that the image is false. The horror is that the image is convincing. Television is especially dangerous in this way because it has always borrowed authority from presentation. A lower third caption looks official. A station bug looks official. A schedule grid looks official. A time slot looks official. A public access channel, precisely because it is local and unpolished, can make the wrong kind of footage feel less like fiction and more like municipal residue.
Not produced for drama.
Not shaped by a studio. Just placed there as though someone in the community knew what it meant. The viewer does not have access to the file history. The viewer does not know whether the tape came from a church, a family, a civic hall, a media center, or a mistake. The viewer sees a portrait, flowers, a still face, perhaps a name. If the program guide says memorial, the mind obeys. It supplies the death. The Associated Press case reminds us that the mind is not the only thing that can obey a wrong status. Institutions can too. That is why this chapter sits between the living funeral material and the later signal intrusion material. It is a hinge. On one side, we have ceremonies that deliberately borrow the appearance of death while life continues. On the other side, we will have the broadcast signal itself becoming unreliable. But here, between ritual and signal, is the administrative layer, the record that tells the viewer what they are seeing. If the record is wrong, the image becomes a weapon without intending to. A funeral portrait of a living person can be a meditation. A funeral portrait of a living person broadcast under a mistaken death label becomes something else. It becomes a public announcement that should never have been made. A social death. A bureaucratic haunting.
A moment when the living have to argue with a system that has already placed them beyond reply. The Uniform Determination of Death Act, as summarized by Cornell's Hoax, is meant to anchor the line. Irreversible cessation of circulatory and respiratory functions. Irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain, including the brainstem. These are not poetic categories. They are thresholds for reality in medical and legal terms. But analog nightmares do not usually begin by disproving the law. They begin by asking whether the law's reality can survive transmission. A doctor may know. A hospital record may say one thing. A family may know another. A news report may later correct the public understanding. But what if the tape was already labeled? What if the listing was already printed? What if the broadcast automation already took the file at face value? What if, for one night, a living person was made dead by the chain of custody around an image? There is a special coldness in that kind of fear. It does not lunge. It processes. It waits in a database. It hides in a folder. It appears as a typo no one recognizes because the footage seems to confirm it. A coffin, a portrait, a slow piece of music, a ceremony arranged around farewell. The screen does not have to say, "This person is dead." It only has to omit the fact that they are not. And the viewer, sitting in the quiet light of a local channel, completes the error. The Kentucky Report gives this nightmare its most human pressure point. A living person was mistakenly declared dead. Surgery was avoided. The man was alive when the case was publicized in 2024. Those facts are enough. They show that the category of death, which feels absolute from the outside, can be mishandled within the systems built to certify it. Once that is admitted, the imagined funeral broadcast becomes less about supernatural resurrection and more about institutional misrecognition. The terror is not that the dead return. It is that the living are filed away before they have left. And when a channel carries that error into the home, it gains a second life. The mistake is no longer confined to paperwork. It becomes a signal. It becomes sound and image. It becomes a memory in the viewer's mind, something seen before it was understood. From there, the tape no longer needs the station to be malicious. It only needs the station to be wrong. But television has another documented fear waiting beneath that one. Sometimes the wrong thing appears not because a form misclassified it, and not because an archive mislabeled it, but because the signal itself is seized. The screen stops being a window into local procedure and becomes a mask worn by someone outside the room. That is where the fear changes shape. Until now, the danger has been misrecognition, a living person placed inside the symbols of death, or a living person caught in a record that says otherwise. Those fears depend on institutions making mistakes. A form is filled out wrong. A ceremony is stripped of context. A program title is misunderstood. The station carries the error because the error has already entered the system. But the documented history of television has another kind of wound. Sometimes the wrong image arrives because someone forces it there. On Sunday, November 22nd, 1987, WTTW in Chicago was broadcasting the Doctor Who serial Horror of Fang Rock. That title already sounds, from a distance, like it belongs to the invented archive we have been circling, an old signal, a lighthouse story, a horror program arriving through the ordinary schedule of public television. But the interruption that night was not part of Doctor Who. WTTW later reported that its broadcast was interrupted by a pirate signal showing a person wearing a Max Headroom mask. The mask matters. Max Headroom was already a television image about television, a synthetic host, a jittering media figure, a face associated with the electronic surface of the screen. In the WTTW account, the intruder did not simply appear as an unmasked person making a demand or reading a statement. The figure appeared as an imitation of a televised persona, a human body hidden behind the face of a media character. The signal did not just carry a trespasser. It carried a trespasser dressed as television itself. That is why the incident has remained so potent in the culture of analog nightmares. It is not only that a broadcast was interrupted. It is that the interruption looked like the medium had grown a second face. WTTW's account also places the episode inside a larger sequence from the same evening. The station reported that WGN's 9 p.m. newscast was hijacked that night as well. WGN restored its broadcast after about 30 seconds. A short interruption, measured in less than a minute, is still long enough to break the basic agreement between viewer and station. The news is supposed to be a fixed point.
It is supposed to arrive from a known studio, through a known station, at a known hour.
When an unauthorized image replaces it, even briefly, the viewer learns something unsettling. The path from transmitter to living room is not as sealed as it feels. The WGN interruption came during a newscast. The later WTTW interruption came during Doctor Who. The difference is important because it shows how the same violation can take on different emotional temperatures depending on what it interrupts. During the news, the intrusion attacks public authority and routine information. During a science fiction serial, especially one titled Horror of Fang Rock, the intrusion blends with atmosphere. It becomes harder, for a first startled second, to know whether the program has changed tone or the world outside the program has entered it. This is one of the quiet mechanics that analog horror often borrows from real broadcasting. The terror begins in a moment of uncertainty. Is this part of the show? Is the station having trouble? Is this a local break? Is this a joke? Is this emergency information? By the time the viewer knows that something is wrong, the image has already been received. The max headroom intrusion gives our investigation a documented example of television behaving like an unsecured threshold. That does not make the public access funeral tape real. The record we have followed still does not support a confirmed incident in which a public access station deliberately broadcast a funeral for people still alive. But the max headroom case proves that unauthorized images have reached ordinary viewers through real broadcast infrastructure. It gives the imagined tape a different kind of plausibility, not as a verified event, but as a fear assembled from things television has actually done. And the details matter because the nightmare we are studying depends on the viewer's helplessness at the moment of reception. Public access created a civic opening for local material. Living funerals created real ceremonies where the living could appear inside funeral imagery. False death determinations showed that records can misplace a person on the wrong side of mortality. The broadcast intrusion adds a fourth element. The station itself can be made to show something it did not intend to show. In that sense, the max headroom mask is not a detour from the funeral tape. It is a key part of the machinery beneath it. Imagine, without claiming it happened, the experience of turning on a local channel and seeing a memorial program for someone who is not dead. One explanation would be bureaucratic error. Another would be miscaptioned ritual. Another would be a tape submitted under false pretenses. But after November 22, 1987, the archive has to admit one more documented category: intrusion. The image on the channel may not belong to the station at all. The WTTW report described the interruption as a pirate signal. That phrase carries a certain old-world drama, but in this context, it means something precise enough for our purposes. The legitimate broadcast was displaced by an unauthorized one. The viewer did not choose the pirate signal. The home receiver simply obeyed whatever reached it with sufficient force and placement. The screen did not ask the viewer whether the image was approved. It displayed what arrived. That is the special dread of broadcast media. A book waits to be opened. A tape waits to be played. A website waits to be loaded. Broadcast, especially in the older sense, comes toward the home on a schedule. It fills the room at the appointed time. It feels official because it has always arrived under a station's name, with a channel number, a call sign, a familiar rhythm of programming. When that rhythm is interrupted, the violation feels intimate. Not because someone has entered the house physically, but because something unauthorized has entered a domestic routine that felt protected by distance. WGN's recovery after about 30 seconds is reassuring on paper. The station restored its broadcast. The interruption ended. The system returned to its expected function. But for viewers who saw it, restoration could not erase the knowledge that the break had occurred. The fact of the breach remained. A signal had worn a mask and stepped into a newscast. WTTW's later interruption during Horror of Fang Rock extended that feeling into a different register. Public television, genre programming, Sunday night viewing, all of it suggests a quieter domestic scene than a breaking news event. The kind of room where someone might be half attentive, where the glow of the screen is part of the evening rather than a crisis. Then the image changes. A masked figure appears. The program is no longer only a program. The schedule has become porous.
For our archive heading score report frame, the restraint is important. We do not need to invent extra claims around the incident. We do not need to add motives, names, threats, or supernatural meanings. The documented facts are already enough. WTTW reported the interruption of Doctor Who, Horror of Fang Rock, on Sunday, November 22nd, 1987. WTTW reported the figure in a Max Headroom mask. WTTW reported the earlier hijacking of WGN's 9 p.m. newscast and WGN's restoration of its broadcast after about 30 seconds. Those points alone create a durable model of fear. A channel can be trusted for years, and then, for half a minute, it can become unfamiliar.
A station can hold a schedule,
maintain equipment, identify itself to viewers, and still be remembered for the night an unknown image broke through. The incident does not require the whole system to collapse. It only requires a moment when the authority of the signal is no longer obvious. That is exactly the kind of moment in which a funeral for the living would become terrifying. Not because the viewer immediately knows what has happened, but because the viewer cannot know.
Is the person on the screen dead? Is the ceremony symbolic? Is the station mistaken? Is the program mislabeled?
Or has someone outside the approved chain forced the image into the feed? The mask does not answer.
It replaces the answer.
And once a mask has appeared in the archive, every later unexplained tape inherits a small part of its shadow. The question shifts from what was broadcast to who, if anyone, controlled the broadcast at the moment it reached the public. That is where the Max Headroom incident continues to pull us, away from the living room and toward master control, toward the people who saw the disruption from inside the station, and toward the unresolved fact that the figure behind the mask was never publicly named. The previous chapter left us at the edge of the picture, with the mask on the screen and the station no longer feeling like a protected room. That is the important turn in the Max Headroom incident. It is not only that viewers saw something strange. It is that people inside the broadcast chain also had to recognize, in real time, that something had entered a system they were supposed to control. The horror of an intrusion is different from the horror of a mistake. A mistaken label can be corrected. A bad tape can be pulled. A schedule can be checked against a log. But when the signal itself is interrupted, the question becomes more direct and more disturbing. Who has access? Who knows enough? Who is close enough to the machinery or clever enough with it to make the station carry an image it did not choose? WTTW's own account of the Max Headroom incident keeps the focus on that practical terror. The interruption came during the Doctor Who serial, Horror of Fang Rock, on Sunday, November 22nd, 1987. Earlier that evening, WGN's 9 p.m. newscast had also been hijacked, and WGN restored its broadcast after about 30 seconds. WTTW's later interruption lasted about 90 seconds, according to WTTW. Those numbers matter because they place the event in a narrow operational window. This was not a vague rumor about a strange broadcast somewhere. It was a disruption measured in seconds, attached to named stations, a named program, and a specific night. WTTW named Paul Rizzo as the WTTW air director, who recalled the disruption from Master Control. That phrase, Master Control, carries a special weight in this story. To the viewer at home, television arrives as a flat sequence. One image replaces another, one program follows the next, and the channel itself seems almost natural, like water coming through a pipe. But inside a station, the broadcast is the result of routing, switching, monitoring, and timing. Master Control is where the outgoing signal is watched and managed. It is not mystical. It is technical. That is what makes the image of an interruption more unsettling, not less. Because the strange thing did not only appear in a living room, it appeared against a system built to notice what was leaving the building. In an archive report horror story, this is where speculation usually tries to take over. A masked figure appears. The perpetrator is not publicly identified. The mind begins to draw maps. An insider, an engineer, a hobbyist, someone with a grudge, someone playing a private joke at public scale. But the researched record does not give us permission to solve the case. It gives us a more limited, and in some ways stronger, fact. WTTW reported that the Federal Communications Commission investigated the 1987 Max Headroom incident and that the perpetrator was not identified. That unresolved ending is not a decorative mystery. It is the structural lesson of the case. The Federal Communications Commission matters here because it is not a fan forum, a message board, or a later retelling. It is the federal agency tied to communications law and broadcast regulation. When WTTW says the FCC investigated, the incident moves into the category of a real regulatory concern. But when the same account says the perpetrator was not identified, the official structure reaches its limit. There is an inquiry, but no named culprit. There is a violation of control, but no public face behind it. The mask remains a mask. WTTW also named Al Skierkiewicz as a broadcast engineer who said the culprit likely had sophisticated technical knowledge. That detail narrows the fear without resolving it. It does not tell us who did it. It does not give us a confession or a recovered device. It does not turn the intrusion into a neat puzzle with a final piece. Instead, it tells us what kind of act the event appeared to be to someone with broadcast knowledge. Not a random accident. Not a ghost in the wires. Not the screen simply failing in a cinematic way. An act requiring technical understanding. That is why the Max Headroom incident remains so useful to the atmosphere of this episode. It lets us stay grounded while still standing in the dark. There is no need to invent a hidden basement, a secret cult, or a cursed tape. The documented facts already produce the pressure. 2 Chicago television stations were interrupted on the same night. One interruption was during a newscast. Another came during Doctor Who. A person in a Max Headroom mask appeared. WTTW identified station personnel who remembered or assessed the event from the broadcast side. The FCC investigated. No perpetrator was identified. The result is a rare kind of public uncertainty. Not private uncertainty, where one person misremembers a tape. Not folklore uncertainty, where a story has no clear origin. Public uncertainty, an incident documented by a station, investigated by federal authorities, and still left without a named person at the center. For our larger premise, that matters more than any invented confession would. We began with a supposed public access funeral tape for people still alive, and we have been careful not to claim that such a broadcast has been verified as a real incident. The archive does not support that exact story. But the Max Headroom case shows why the imagined tape can feel plausible in the nervous system of analog media. Broadcast viewers have experienced a real moment when the approved chain did not fully explain what appeared on the screen. Station personnel have had to confront a signal that did not behave as scheduled. Investigators have entered the story and still not produced a public culprit. That last fact changes the way an archive feels. If every strange broadcast could be solved by checking the log, the nightmare would remain administrative. If every mislabeled program could be corrected by finding the original tape box, the fear would remain clerical. But an unsolved intrusion says that sometimes the record preserves the wound without preserving the hand that made it. You can know the date. You can know the station. You can know the program. You can know the approximate duration. You can know the agency that investigated. And still, at the center, there is no name. This is the point at which the archive becomes colder than rumor. Rumor can keep adding details until the story feels complete. The archive may refuse that comfort. It may give only what was documented and then stop. Master control, in this chapter, is not a villain's chamber. It is not a supernatural threshold. It is a workplace. It is where a broadcast is monitored, where signals are managed, where the scheduled image is expected to stay scheduled. That ordinary function is what makes the disruption so valuable to analog horror. The terror comes from a normal system briefly losing its claim to normality. The room still exists. The staff still exist. The equipment still exists. The broadcast still goes out. But for a short period, the output belongs to an unknown actor. A public access channel, by contrast, might not need a pirate signal to become frightening. Its openness, its localism, its low-budget tapes and community submissions can already blur the line between official programming and personal material. But the Max Headroom incident adds a sharper possibility. It says that even beyond scheduling errors, even beyond mislabeled ceremonies, even beyond an archive that strips context from a living funeral, There is another path by which the wrong image can reach the public.
Someone can force the door.
And if the forced door is never traced back to a person, every later unexplained image has to be considered in that shadow.
That does not mean every strange tape is an intrusion.
It does not mean every local broadcast mystery hides a technical attack. The discipline of this report is to avoid that leap. The documented record gives us one famous broadcast intrusion, not a universal explanation. But as a piece of atmosphere, as a historical pressure point, it is enough. It proves that the home screen was never purely domestic. It was connected to systems, permissions, towers, cables, operators, regulators, and people with knowledge most viewers did not possess. The person at home saw the mask. The station saw a disruption. The regulator investigated. The public received no identified culprit. That sequence is almost the perfect shape of an analog nightmare.
Appearance. Alarm. Inquiry. Silence.
And silence is not the same as emptiness. In cases like this, silence becomes part of the surviving material. It clings to the footage because the footage cannot answer for itself. It clings to the station account because the account can name the moment, but not the person behind it. It clings to the FCC investigation because investigation, in this case, did not produce public identification. What remains is not proof of a larger conspiracy. It is a documented absence. For the imagined funeral tape, this absence is the most dangerous inheritance. If a broadcast appears to show a funeral for people who are still alive, there are several factual fears already available. The ceremony might be a living funeral. The record might be wrong. The label might be misleading. The archive might be incomplete. But after max headroom, another question enters quietly and stays there. Did the station actually send this, or was the station used? That question cannot be answered by the viewer. It may not even be answerable by the surviving tape. A recording captures what reached the screen, not necessarily who controlled the route. It preserves the image, but not the intention. It gives the body of the broadcast without the mind behind it. The Max Headroom incident remains, then, not because of the mask alone, but because of the unfinished chain behind the mask. Paul Rizzo's recollection places the disruption inside the operational reality of WTTW. Al Skierkevich's assessment points toward technical sophistication. The FCC investigation confirms that the event rose to official concern. The absence of an identified perpetrator leaves the archive open at its most important seam. From that seam, the fear moves naturally toward another kind of broadcast authority, not the entertainment signal, but the alert signal. If an unauthorized image can disturb trust in the channel, then a false emergency message can disturb trust in public warning itself. And once the language of official warning is misused, the screen does not merely show something wrong. It tells the public that danger has arrived and asks them to believe it before they can verify anything. The previous chapter left the signal in a state of uncertainty. A masked interruption had shown that a broadcast could be entered from the outside, or at least made to appear that way to the people watching at home. But the alert system carries a different kind of authority. A strange figure on a late-night program may frighten, confuse, or become folklore. An emergency message does something more direct. It borrows the voice of public safety. That is why the emergency alert system matters to this archive. It is not just another sound that can be used for atmosphere. It is not only a familiar tone in the background of television history. It is a legal and civic mechanism built around trust. The trust that when a warning interrupts ordinary programming, the interruption has been authorized, and the danger being described is real enough to require immediate attention. In 2013, the Federal Communications Commission warned that transmitting emergency alert system attention signals or codes or simulations of them outside a genuine alert or an authorized test violates federal law. The warning was not framed as a matter of taste. It was not simply about keeping broadcasts orderly. The Commission stated that this kind of misuse undermines public safety. That phrase is important because it identifies the deeper injury. A false alert does not only startle an audience for a moment. It weakens the meaning of the warning system itself. It trains the public, even briefly, to ask whether the next interruption is real. It turns the machinery of emergency communication into another unstable image on the screen. For an analog nightmare, that is a quiet but devastating shift. Earlier, The fear came from local access being open enough for strange material to appear. Then it came from the possibility that death rituals could be real, even when the person at the center of them was alive. Then it came from records and institutions that might name a living person as dead. Then from an intrusion in which the broadcast chain itself seemed to be wearing someone else's face. The emergency alert system adds a final layer, the official warning that may not be official at all. The Federal Communications Commission's 2013 advisory, Enforcement Advisory Number 2013-7, DA 13-2123, dated November 5, 2013, exists because the tones and codes of the emergency alert system are not ordinary production elements. They are designed to attract attention and trigger response. Their power comes from recognition. A viewer hears or sees the familiar structure and understands, before the full message is processed, that something has crossed the threshold from programming into warning. That threshold is exactly what horror wants to violate. A public access funeral tape, if imagined as a piece of lost local media, frightens because it looks procedural. It does not need funder, a monster, or a confession. It can be a static camera, a printed name, a memorial image, a community room, a station identification card, a schedule block that no one remembers approving. Its terror comes from the way familiar media forms can become hostile when the context is wrong. A false emergency alert operates by the same principle, but with higher stakes. It takes the most urgent language available to broadcast infrastructure and detaches it from truth. The viewer is not merely watching a mistake. The viewer is being instructed to treat a fiction as danger. The FCC's concern was not hypothetical. In an order discussing emergency alert system misuse, the Commission cited a 2013 zombie attack hoax in which false alerts warned that dead bodies were rising from graves. The image is almost too blunt, almost too close to cheap genre fiction, and that is precisely why it belongs in this investigation. Here was a documented misuse of alert infrastructure tied to a message about the dead rising. Not a rumor about an old cemetery. Not a story whispered after a late-night broadcast. A false alert using the authority of emergency communication, telling members of the public that dead bodies were rising from graves. The phrase collapses the distance between bureaucratic warning and supernatural panic. It takes the language of official notice and fills it with impossible content. The result is not simply absurd. It is corrosive. The viewer is asked to respond to a world in which the authorities appear to confirm the return of the dead. This is where the episode's central image begins to sharpen. A station broadcasting a funeral for people still alive is not confirmed by reliable sources as a real public access incident. That remains the boundary of the archive. But the supporting fears are not invented from nothing. Public warning systems have been misused. False alerts have carried impossible claims. Federal regulators have had to say, plainly, that even simulations of emergency alert system tones and codes outside a genuine alert or authorized test are unlawful because they threaten public safety. The nightmare is not that every strange broadcast is real. The nightmare is that the forms of reality are recognizable enough to be counterfeited. A viewer does not need to understand the full legal structure of the emergency alert system to feel the effect of its misuse. The alert arrives with an inherited seriousness. It interrupts rather than asks permission. It places ordinary programming beneath a higher command. It implies that someone, somewhere, has verified the danger and decided the public must know. When that implication is false, the damage is not limited to the minutes of confusion. The archive retains the break. Later, when the event is described, the account sounds impossible. The television said the dead were rising. Yet the impossibility is anchored to a real pathway. The message did not have to be believed by everyone to matter. It only had to enter the channel of public warning. This is also why false alerts belong beside the Max Headroom intrusion rather than after it as a separate curiosity. The Max Headroom incident showed that the broadcast image could be displaced. The false alert shows that broadcast authority could be displaced. One attacks the continuity of programming. The other attacks the credibility of emergency instruction. Both depend on a viewer meeting the screen halfway. In one case, the viewer sees a masked figure and understands that the usual order of the channel has failed. In the other, the viewer sees or hears the architecture of an alert and understands that the ordinary order of daily life may have failed.
The screen becomes not a passive surface, but an agent of escalation.
The dead rising hoax also connects with the funeral tape premise in a more specific way.
Throughout this investigation, death has appeared not only as an event, but as a category managed by systems.
There are rituals that rehearse it while the participant is alive. There are records that can mistakenly place a living person among the dead. There are broadcasts that can carry memorial material beyond its intended setting. The zombie alert hoax adds another distortion, an emergency message that treats the dead not as mourned, filed, or misclassified, but as active. It turns the grave into a breaking news location. And because the false alert used the form of public warning, the impossible claim arrived dressed as public information. That is the essential analog horror mechanism here. The terror does not begin with belief. It begins with presentation. A thing is placed in the correct format, and for a few seconds, the mind reacts before skepticism catches up. This is why the FCC's language about undermining public safety is so important. Emergency communication depends on speed. It cannot function if every recipient must first conduct a full investigation into whether the warning is genuine. The system assumes that certain signals will be protected from casual imitation. It assumes that the public will learn to associate those signals with authorized alerts and tests, not with advertisements, entertainment, pranks, or hoaxes. When that protection is broken, even once, the break becomes part of the culture's memory of television. Viewers remember not only what happened, but what could happen. A warning can lie. A signal can be worn like a mask. A local channel can become an archive of things that should have remained private, ceremonial, mistaken, or impossible. The power of the imagined funeral tape comes from placing all of these fears in one room. A public access station has the local, lightly polished character that makes strange footage plausible. Living funerals provide a real ritual vocabulary in which coffins, portraits, wills, and shrouds can belong to the living. Mistaken death declarations show that systems can briefly fail at the most basic human classification. Broadcast intrusions show that the signal can be interrupted by an unidentified actor. False emergency alerts show that official warning itself can be misused, even to announce a fantasy of the dead rising. None of these facts proves that the exact tape existed, but they explain why the tape feels as though it could have been found. That distinction is the spine of the archive report form. It refuses to certify the legend, but it also refuses to dismiss the machinery that makes the legend legible. The horror is not a single verified broadcast. It is the convergence of open channels, ritual images, administrative error, signal vulnerability, and public warning misuse. Each piece is documented in its own place. Together, they form the outline of an impossible program. By the time the alert system enters the story, the screen has already become unstable. It can mislabel. It can memorialize. It can be hijacked. Now it can also command fear under the sign of official urgency. A funeral for the living would not need to arrive as a supernatural event. It could arrive as scheduling, paperwork, user access, old equipment, and a public trained to believe the shape of the message before it has time to question the source. That is where the reconstruction has to begin, not with the claim that the broadcast happened, but with the documented parts that make it imaginable. That is where the reconstruction has to begin, not with a hidden file, not with a station log that proves the impossible, and not with a witness who can finally name the tape. It begins with parts. Each part is ordinary enough on its own. A local channel, a user-submitted program, a ritual that resembles a funeral but is meant for the living, a record that marks a person incorrectly, a signal that can be interrupted, an alert language that carries authority before it carries proof. Placed separately, these are civic facts, cultural practices, administrative failures, and broadcast incidents. Placed together, they become the model for the tape. The important caution is also the center of the model. There is no reliable source in the record before us confirming that a real, public access station deliberately broadcast a funeral for people who are still alive. That absence matters. It is the difference between a documented case and an archive report nightmare. But the absence does not make the image empty. It makes it assembled. The horror is not that one confirmed station did exactly this. The horror is that the pieces needed to make it feel plausible already exist in public life. Start with the channel itself. Public, educational, and governmental access channels, the PEG channels, were not built as national entertainment networks. They were local instruments. Local franchising authorities could require cable operators to set aside channel capacity for public, educational, or governmental use. They could also require services, facilities, or equipment to support that use. The policy logic was tied to localism and to the fact that cable systems used public rights-of-way, the streets and sidewalks that belong to the civic environment before they belong to a signal path. That matters because the imagined funeral tape does not need to look like something smuggled into a major studio. It needs to look like something that came through a smaller door. A city meeting, a school district event, a local parade, a memorial service recorded on borrowed equipment, a cassette handed to someone at a desk, a program scheduled because the paperwork was in order, the runtime was acceptable, the user had taken training, and the content did not trigger the limited reasons for refusal. The Federal Communications Commission's description of PEG use allows for rules such as content-neutral scheduling, minimum production standards, and user training. Those rules are not evidence of chaos. They are evidence of a system trying to be open without being completely formless. But openness creates a particular kind of vulnerability and horror. A viewer does not have to imagine a secret cult controlling the station. The viewer only has to imagine ordinary access doing exactly what it was designed to do, letting local material appear on the local channel. Then comes the sharper legal unease. Cable operators generally may not control the content of public access programming, except that they may refuse programming reasonably believed to contain obscenity. That is not a loophole invented for a story. It is part of the documented tension of public access. The channel is meant to be available to the public. The operator is not meant to behave like a traditional editor over the content. In a healthy civic setting, that protects local speech. In an analog nightmare, it explains why the screen can feel strangely under-supervised. This is why the fictional broadcast, if we reconstruct it carefully, should not feel polished. It should not feel like a network special. It should feel local, procedural, perhaps badly lit. A fixed camera, a title card from a community production system, an altar or portrait held too long in frame, names spoken by someone who sounds more like a volunteer than an announcer. The quiet terror comes from the format matching the channel. If it looked too cinematic, the illusion would break. If it looks like PEG programming, it borrows the authority of the mundane. The second ingredient is the funeral that does not require a death. Living funerals are not invented for this premise. Reuters reported in 2019 that more than 25,000 people had participated in mass living funeral services at Hyowan Healing Center in Seoul since it opened in 2012. The report described participants wearing shrouds, writing wills, facing funeral portraits, and lying inside closed coffins for around 10 minutes. Jong Yong-moon was identified as the head of the center. Participants named in the report included Choi Jin-kyu, a 28-year-old university student, and Cho Jae-hee, 75. Those details matter because they make the impossible image materially legible. A viewer seeing shrouds, portraits, wills, and coffins does not have to be watching an actual death rite in the ordinary sense. The scene could be a confrontation with mortality, a rehearsal, a therapeutic ritual, a public ceremony of reflection. The objects are funeral objects, but the people may still be alive. That gap is where the horror enters. The screen shows the grammar of death while the record of life remains unresolved. Japan adds another variation. A 2024 article reported that 500 people gathered at the Tokyu Hotel in Tokyo on February 19, 1993, for the living funeral of entertainer Mizunoe Takiko, the day before her 78th birthday. The reported ceremony included a portrait, a flower-adorned altar, Chopin, Gregorian chants, Russian religious hymns, and prayers from multiple traditions. Again, the point is not that this ceremony was sinister. The point is that public mourning forms can be rearranged around a living person. A funeral can be staged as a social fact before biological death has occurred. Now add the bureaucratic fear. The Associated Press reported in 2024 on a Kentucky man who had been mistakenly declared dead in 2021. Surgery was avoided,
and he was still alive when the case was publicized.
Cornell's Weck summary of the Uniform Determination of Death Act defines death through irreversible cessation of circulatory and respiratory functions, or irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain, including the brainstem. That legal precision exists because death is not only an emotional event, it is also a status assigned through criteria, records, and institutions. For the imagined broadcast, this is crucial. The nightmare does not require the station to know the truth. It only requires a mismatch between the person and the record. A name entered wrong. A ceremony labeled incorrectly. A memorial program prepared from mistaken information. A living funeral tape filed under funeral programming without the context that the participants were alive. Horror often depends on malice, but this model can function on misclassification. The screen becomes frightening because it speaks with the confidence of an archive while carrying the possibility of error. Then the signal itself becomes unstable. The Max Headroom broadcast intrusion on November 22, 1987, remains one of the clearest examples of broadcast vulnerability entering public memory. WTTW reported that its broadcast of the Doctor Who serial Horror of Fang Rock was interrupted by a pirate signal showing a person in a Max Headroom mask. WGN's 9 p.m. newscast was also hijacked that evening, and WGN restored its broadcast after about 30 seconds. WTTW's interruption lasted about 90 seconds. The Federal Communications Commission investigated, but did not identify the perpetrator. That incident does not prove anything about a funeral tape. It proves something about the viewer's fear. Television can be made to stop being itself. A known program can suddenly carry an unknown image. The authority of the channel can be borrowed by an unidentified source. Once that has happened in the documented record, every strange tape inherits a question. Was this scheduled, submitted, mistaken, or forced into the signal? The final ingredient is the voice of official urgency. In 2013, the FCC warned that transmitting emergency alert system attention signals or codes or simulations of them outside a genuine alert or authorized test violates federal law and undermines public safety. An FCC order discussing EAS misuse cited a 2013 zombie attack hoax in which false alerts warned that dead bodies were rising from graves. That example is almost too direct for horror, but its importance is institutional. It shows that broadcast language can cause fear, not simply by what it says, but by sounding like a system the public has been trained to obey. So the impossible broadcast can now be reconstructed without being claimed as real. It is a collage of documented anxieties. PEG Access supplies the local channel and the limited gatekeeping. Living funerals supply the funeral imagery around people who are still alive. Mistaken death declarations supply the administrative dread that a living person can be processed as dead. Broadcast intrusions supply the fear that the signal may not be under its rightful control. EAS misuse supplies the knowledge that official media forms can be imitated, abused, and made to panic the audience. In that model, the tape does not need a monster. It needs a schedule. It needs a title card. It needs names that match real people too closely. It needs the flat patience of a community channel continuing to play because nobody in the room knows, yet, that the people being mourned have not died. Or because the tape is not a death record at all, but a living ritual stripped of its explanation by bad labeling, bad timing, or bad intent. That is why the image remains so persuasive even without a verified case. It is not floating above the archive. It is built from the archive's edges, where access meets trust, where ritual meets record, where preservation meets error, and where the signal enters the home already wearing the face of authority. The confirmed record does not give us the funeral broadcast as fact. It gives us the machinery that would make the viewer hesitate before changing the channel. And that hesitation is the last piece. The funeral still plays because the systems around it are familiar. We know local channels can carry ordinary community footage. We know death can be rehearsed symbolically. We know records can be wrong. We know signals have been interrupted. We know warning systems can be misused. The impossible program becomes frightening not because it comes from nowhere, but because it appears to come from everywhere we already agreed to trust. That is why the last image is not the coffin and not the portrait and not even the tape. The last image is the viewer waiting.
A hand on the remote. A room lit by cable glow.
A local channel that has always seemed too ordinary to be dangerous. The kind of channel that carries city meetings, school events, parades, announcements, and programs made close enough to home that they feel almost beneath suspicion.
The program on the screen does not need to explain itself right away. It only needs to look official enough, local enough, and scheduled enough to make the viewer pause. That pause is where the contradiction from the beginning of this investigation finally resolves. The confirmed record does not give us a verified public access station that deliberately broadcast funerals for people who are still alive. It does not give us a named station manager, a recovered schedule, a police report, or an authenticated tape that proves the full story as an event. If we are staying with the sources, then the impossible broadcast remains impossible as history. But horror is not only made from things that happened. It is also made from things that institutions make believable. And the record gives us those institutions. It gives us public, educational, and governmental access channels, the PEG channels built into American cable policy as tools of localism. It gives us local franchising authorities that may require cable operators to set aside channel capacity for public, educational, or governmental use. It gives us support structures, including services, facilities, and equipment that can allow community programming to reach homes through a system that uses public rights-of-way, such as streets and sidewalks. It gives us rules that may be content neutral, practical, and procedural, scheduling, production standards, user training. And it gives us the strange civic bargain at the center of public access. Cable operators generally may not control the content of public access programming, except in the limited case of programming reasonably believed to contain obscenity. That restriction is not sinister. It is part of the access principle. It helps keep a local channel from becoming only another gate-kept outlet. It protects the possibility that ordinary people, not just institutions with polished media departments, can speak on a local screen. But in an analog nightmare, the same openness becomes atmosphere. Not because public access is evil, because it is plausible. A funeral program on a local channel would not have to arrive with cinematic thunder. It could arrive as a submitted tape, a memorial service, a community ritual, a mislabeled file, a program slotted into the wrong hour, something produced by someone outside the cable operator's normal editorial control, something that looks less like an intrusion because it uses the grammar of permitted local media. That is why the public access setting matters more than any invented haunted station. A haunted station would explain too much. A real civic media structure explains just enough. The record also gives us preservation. The Library of Congress Public Broadcasting Web Archive includes websites associated with United States public broadcasting entities, and it complements the American Archive of Public Broadcasting, a collaboration between the Library of Congress and GBH in Boston. The Library of Congress states that the collection period for that web archive began in May 2019 and is ongoing. That fact belongs to the ordinary world of cultural memory, not to folklore. It tells us that broadcasts and their surrounding institutions do not simply vanish when the screen goes dark. Some traces are collected, some schedules survive, some websites are captured. Some local media become searchable after the community that made it has already changed. In horror, that changes the nature of the tape. The tape is no longer just a lost object. It becomes an archival possibility, something that might have been preserved by accident, cataloged under a dull title, clipped from context, or separated from the human explanation that once made it harmless. A community program can outlive the room in which it was produced. A ritual can outlive the people who understood its purpose. A mistake can become more convincing with age because time removes the correction. The record gives us ritual, too. Reuters reported in 2019 that more than 25,000 people had taken part in mass living funeral services at Seoul's Hyeowon Healing Center since it opened in 2012. Participants wore shrouds, wrote wills, faced funeral portraits, and lay inside closed coffins for around 10 minutes. Reuters identified Jong Yong-moon as the head of the center and named participants including Choi Jin-kyu, a 28-year-old university student, and Cho Jae-hee, who was 75. Those details matter because they remove the easiest dismissal. A funeral for the living is not, by itself, an invented image. It can be a ritual form, a confrontation with mortality,
a rehearsal meant to return the participant to life with altered perspective. In Japan, a 2024 article reported that 500 people gathered at the Tokyo Hotel in Tokyo on February 19, 1993, for the living funeral of entertainer Mizunoe Takiko the day before her 78th birthday. The reported ceremony included a portrait, a flower-adorned altar, Chopin, Gregorian chants, Russian religious hymns, and prayers from multiple traditions. Again, the horror is not in mocking the ritual. The horror is in removing the explanation. Inside the ritual, the living funeral has meaning. On a local broadcast with no context, it may become a death notice. A portrait can become evidence. A shroud can become confirmation. A closed coffin can become an announcement the viewer was never prepared to receive. If the person named in the program is known to be alive, the screen does not feel symbolic. It feels wrong. Then the record gives us error. The Associated Press reported in 2024 on a Kentucky case in which a man had been mistakenly declared dead in 2021. Surgery was avoided, and the man was still alive when the case was publicized. Cornell's Weck's summary of the Uniform Determination of Death Act gives the legal frame. Death may be defined by irreversible cessation of circulatory and respiratory functions, or irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain, including the brainstem. That definition is precise. The mistake is terrifying because precision exists, and still, the living can be mishandled by the systems around death. A funeral broadcast for living people does not need a ghost if paperwork can briefly make the world behave as if a person has already died. It does not need supernatural knowledge if a name, a file, a medical status, or a civic record can be wrong. Bureaucratic error is quiet. It does not announce itself as horror. It arrives through forms, databases, calls, signatures, and assumptions. By the time it reaches a screen, it may already look official. And the record gives us the signal itself. WTTW reported that on November 22, 1987, its broadcast of the Doctor Who serial, Horror of Fang Rock, was interrupted by a pirate signal, showing a person in a Max Headroom mask. WGN's 9 p.m. newscast was also hijacked that evening, and WGN restored its broadcast after about 30 seconds. WTTW reported that the Federal Communications Commission investigated the incident but did not identify the perpetrator. That story endures because it left a wound in viewer confidence. A broadcast was not supposed to be reachable from the outside in that way, and then, for a short time, it appeared to be. The masked figure mattered less than the opening it revealed. The screen could be entered. The scheduled program could be displaced. The channel could become uncertain while still looking like television. The emergency alert system adds another layer. The FCC warned in 2013 that transmitting emergency alert system attention signals or codes, or simulations of them, outside a genuine alert or authorized test violates federal law and undermines public safety. An FCC order discussing misuse cited a 2013 zombie attack hoax in which false alerts warned that dead bodies were rising from graves. That detail sounds almost too theatrical, but it is documented in the context of real regulatory concern. The message did not need to be plausible in order to be dangerous. It needed access to a trusted warning format. It needed the shape of authority. This is the final answer to why the funeral still plays. Not because we can prove that one station deliberately aired funerals for living people. We cannot. Not from the confirmed record here. It still plays because every supporting system is real enough. The local channel is real enough. The access framework is real enough. The limits on operator control are real enough. The archives are real enough. The living funerals are real enough. The mistaken death declaration is real enough. The signal intrusion is real enough. The false alert is real enough. Each fact stops short of proving the legend. Together, they build the room in which the legend can breathe. And maybe that is the more durable horror. A monster can be disproved when the mask comes off. A hoax can be named when the confession arrives. But a broadcast assembled from trusted systems does not end so cleanly. It leaves behind a quieter suspicion that the screen may not have lied in one impossible way, but in several ordinary ways at once. A ritual mistaken for a notice. A record mistaken for truth. An archive mistaken for proof.
a signal mistaken for authority.
The public access funeral tape remains unverified as an incident,
But as a nightmare, it is almost overqualified.
it is not a story about one impossible broadcast breaking into the world. It is a story about the world already containing the channels, procedures, rituals, errors, and alerts that would make such a broadcast feel real for just long enough.
Long enough for the viewer to stop. Long enough for the room to go quiet.
Long enough to see a living name beneath a funeral portrait and wonder whether the mistake is on the screen, in the records, or in the life still continuing somewhere outside the frame.